Sometimes you arrive in your garage and you realize you don't remember how you got there. You don't remember the drive at all. Were you unconscious during the drive? Of course not. You were conscious, but you're not metacognitive of the experience of driving because you're mulling your problems or you were thinking about something else. It doesn't mean that you were unconscious of your driving, it only means that you didn't re-represent it. For an idealist, the world doesn't cease to exist. It's just that the idealist accounts for that world in a different way, a more sane way, but the world's still there and I'm still alive and I'm still up to having fun. We fear the process of death. We don't fear what will happen after. That is not a given. That is actually derived from a certain metaphysical position called physicalism, which is entirely untenable. Your life has never been, is not, and will never be about you. Not any more than the life of the apple tree is about one apple blossom. I do not have the responsibility to make myself happy, which is the most overwhelming task that the cultural ethos invests us with. One,
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible. There are way too many variables at play for you to be able to control them. So you cannot make yourself happy. You may find yourself happy because of grace and circumstance, but it's not something that you can force in nature. And parting with that need to make myself happy, it's like removing a ton of weight from my shoulder. The intellect is still the bouncer of my heart. It's just that it's a more sensitive and open-minded bouncer now, but it can still shut the door.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Love and Philosophy, where we try to talk about deep, meaningful subjects across traditional either or divides or ways we're told we should talk about these subjects. This is a conversation with Bernardo Kastrup, who is the executive director of the Essentia Foundation, and he set off this renaissance in rethinking what idealism might be, metaphysical idealism, in his most recent book, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell, which I highly recommend. Basically, the idea is that reality is mental. And for some of you, that might not make any sense. For others, it might make perfect sense and feel very controversial. Bernardo gets all kinds of reactions, but he's an incredibly clear thinker and incredibly articulate person to talk to about many things, especially philosophy. He has a PhD in philosophy. He has a PhD in computer engineering. He works as a scientist. He works as a philosopher. He was part of CERN, which is the European Organization for Nuclear Research, in some really exciting days of that organization. He was part of the Phillips Research Laboratories. It goes on and on, honestly. He's co-founded a parallel processor company called Silicon Hive. He works on these really super cool retro computers that I just absolutely love, which you can see on his website. And he's a philosopher who's putting forth some very interesting ideas. I remember the first time I really heard of Bernardo, someone told me that his way of seeing the world reminded them of something I was presenting at a conference, and I should check him out. But he's very controversial, they said. I'll let you decide if you think that's true or not. But the reason people do say that is because his idea is that reality is fundamentally mental or essentially mental. And we talk about that here in terms of consciousness. I sort of frame it around consciousness because that's the research question that I was contemplating and the reason I wanted to talk to him. So we talk about what consciousness is, how it gets confused. I wonder if the word unconscious is even not applicable ever. I'll do another post about that. I'll post that separately. For now, I just want to let you listen to Bernardo. And I hope that wherever you are, you're doing well today. If you want to help Love and Philosophy, there's a million ways, and I definitely appreciate it. But most importantly, I just hope that you can think about this as philosophy as a way of life, and whatever you might want to take from it that helps you, I hope it does. If these subjects might not seem like they have anything to do with what you're dealing with today, if you're dealing with some problems, but I just hope that you can feel some love coming from me. And I don't mean that in a sticky, sentimental way. I really just mean that I'm trying to open my pathway so that it meets yours in some way that's helpful. So maybe there's something in here that helps. I hope so. All right, here's Bernardo. Is there anything you want to know before we jump in, or anything you want to talk about today that's on your mind?
Let's jump in.
Okay, let's jump in. So let's start with consciousness.
All right.
I found this Scientific American article of yours.
In like a dozen.
Well, this one in particular, it was talking about how people often use consciousness in the wrong way or a misguided way, or they assume metaconsciousness
Oh, yeah.
rather than consciousness. And this one in particular that was about children, about babies, and studies that are done which say they become conscious at the age of 5 or something.
Which is, of course, absurd if you
Yeah,
understand
it sounds
consciousness to be
absurd.
experience. Yeah.
But it's not absurd to a lot of people. And I know this word is potent, difficult, but it is something I think about a lot, of the way we use it, and we all hear it differently or have different interpretations of it. But especially this article, when a child is born, is it already consciousness? I mean, can we go ahead and say any life that's moving or making way, experiencing maybe in your terms, is already consciousness in some sense? Would you agree with that?
I mean, to think that a newborn does not experience that when a newborn cries immediately after being born, he's crying completely unconsciously, that there is no experience. It's just a mechanism in there producing the sound of crying in order to get help of some form. I think that that's preposterous in this day and age. I think we are better than that now. Maybe Descartes could think that in the 17th century, but not human beings in the 21st century, not educated human beings. Of course, experience is there. I believe experience is the experience in the sense of a private conscious point of view, a phenomenal point of view that is private to the organism. I think every organism has such a conscious point of view. Their experiences may be incredibly simple. The experiences of an amoeba, paramecium, may be incredibly simple, of an archaea, may be simple, but I think there is experience every time you see life. Why do I think that? Well, because we metabolize and we know we experience. We know that other higher animals that metabolize experience. We have plenty of indirect evidence for that in case of cetaceans, dolphins, or in the case of pachyderms like elephants, other primates. So even observing life under a microscope, you can see unicellular organisms running away from threats, chasing food. Amoeba can build little vases, houses for themselves out of mud particles at the bottom of the puddle where they live. There's plenty of evidence that everything that metabolizes has a private conscious point of view from the get-go, from the start.
I agree. But why would you think that in these are studies in the blog post, which I'll link to, a lot of the scientists are they wouldn't say that it's not a human, or, they're not trying to be cruel or something, but they really are sort of associating it with, I guess, what you would call metaconsciousness, where
Yeah.
it's almost like the observer can understand that the thing being observed knows that it's somehow a subject, almost.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think there's maliciousness in people making claims that children become conscious at age 5, because there is confusion around the term consciousness. What do we mean by it? And that confusion goes back to the inception of depth psychology at the end of the 19th century. Freud and Jung already talked about the unconscious as a psychic space. Well, if it's not conscious, in what way is it psychic? Well, it is phenomenally conscious. In other words, it's constituted of experiences, but it is not metaconscious. What is metaconsciousness? Metaconsciousness is the explicit awareness of one's own consciousness. It is to know that one has an experience. One can have an experience without metaconsciousness. For instance, we are always conscious of our breathing, but we only become metaconscious of it if I bring your attention to it. Then you start explicitly knowing that you're experiencing the inflation of your rib cage and air flowing through your nostrils and so on. Um, and since the beginning, we have had this confusion. It takes, of course, a while for an infant to become explicitly aware of its own consciousness. In other words, to know that it is having an experience, but it is experiencing from the get-go. And we mistake this a lot, especially in neuroscience, because the report paradigm, there is now, for the past almost 10 years, there is a no report paradigm that is evolving. So that may help things a bit. But for the longest time in neuroscience, investigation of consciousness was based on subjective reports. In other words, you would measure brain activity in a subject, and then you would ask the subject, what are you experiencing? Now, of course, the subject can only report on the contents of metaconsciousness. It can only report on the experiences that it knows it is having. And therefore, we conflate the two. We think that consciousness is reportability. No, no, no. That is metaconsciousness. You need to re-represent metacognitively an experience in order to be able to report that. You report the re-representation, not the original experience. Jonathan Schooler already elaborated on this in 2002 in one of his seminal papers, this distinction between consciousness and metaconsciousness, which is experimentally observed, by the way.
Yeah, this gets kind of messy to try to really unpack, but you brought up phenomenal consciousness, which I'm pretty sure you attribute to Bloch in the normal way that he uses it, which just like
Yeah.
experience, we can say,
Yeah.
so to
Yeah.
speak.
Phenomenal consciousness is that whose excitations are experiences.
Right. But for me, this gets very confusing, especially when someone like a scientist is writing about it, about a subject, because phenomenal consciousness can also often be used in dialogue or in papers to already mean something like re-representation or representation. Because here's the thing, right? The baby, what comes into the world, it is experience. It's not necessarily having experience. I mean, because already when we use that kind of language, we've set something against itself. Do you know what I mean? So there's almost for me a difficulty in that it's already sort of what you might call dissociation or something. This kind of nestedness of the way that we have to speak about it, and we can't always catch ourselves, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
do you know, does that make sense? I just find this is even trickier than it seems, even after we've unpacked it in the way you have.
Of
Yeah.
course, people will tell themselves that if they can't report their experiences to themselves, then they are not having those experiences. Well, in fact, they may be having. In Ed Block's terminology, what we call metaconsciousness would be phenomenal consciousness plus access consciousness together. When we have those two things together, then that's what we mean by metaconsciousness in your science of consciousness. In philosophy, phenomenal consciousness does not require re-representation, does not require the explicit awareness that you are having an experience. Um, my friend Christoph Koch has a different opinion on what I'm about to say, but I still hold on to my own opinion. I think at least some cases of blind sight, it's when an individual acts as though he's seeing. Like if you throw a ball at the individual, he or she will catch that ball. But
Yeah.
he will report to you that no, I couldn't see the ball. It's just that my hand moved and it
Mm-hmm.
happened to catch the ball. I think that at least some of those cases of blind sightness reflect this distinction between consciousness and metaconsciousness. The subject is conscious of seeing the ball. He or she is experiencing the ball, but that experience is not re-represented. So if you ask the subject will tell you, no, I didn't see anything.
Yeah, that makes me think of Gonzaga and those left brain, right brain kind of studies when the corpus callosum was severed. And yeah, that would be a whole other subject. It also makes me think of seeing without eyes. I just had another talk somewhere else about with Alex Gomez Marin or Marin
Yeah,
Gomez. I always get it confused, right?
Maureen,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, and we were talking about that of so yeah, I guess I just feel like even that can get confusing because the body is itself already sensing. And so are we going to talk about any body that's sensing is already experiencing? And so um, let's go to the child coming into the world. That's why I wanted to start it like this. As we agree the body comes in, it's sensing. Is that a kind of consciousness for you? Because I really want to get to what you wrote about Jung too and the unconscious. It's very hard for me to understand how something can be unconscious. Is it still mental, but it's just unconscious for that subject or these kinds of things? So
Yeah.
you can see where I'm sort of trying to get to.
Yeah. Okay, let's start very quickly just to clarify the terminology. You could define sensing as not necessarily entailing experience. So a camera senses something, but it's not experiencing what it's sensing. If you
Yeah.
define sensing that way, then no, sensing does not necessarily come with experience. But a child, I think, doesn't just sense. A child experiences what is sensed, even though the child may not metacognize that experience. A child may not be able to tell itself, I am experiencing this right now.
Mhm.
Um,
Sorry to
how
stop you, but what's the difference there? Because I feel like I'm missing what's the difference between the child is the sensing, right? It's the body, it's sensing. It doesn't have a sense of self like a subject, or even if we don't know if it does, let's assume it's building that, right? Through sensing. I'm glad you made that point about sensing, because often in circles with like people who are in engineering and stuff, they use sensors in a completely different way, and it can get very confusing. So I definitely mean how any body, an embodied creature, is experiencing the world through that body.
I'm not talking about uh, experiencing perceptual contents without perceptual organs. I'm not talking about that. I think that's theoretically a lot more complicated if it happens at all. Uh, uh, from the point of view of the reporting ego, the absence of metacognition, the absence of re-representation, is identical to the absence of experience, because the reporting ego operates at a metacognitive level. Whatever is not re-represented does not reach that level. So from the point of view of the reporting ego, it might as well never have happened. For instance, for the past 2 minutes, you have been experiencing your breathing. But from the point of view of your reporting ego, you cannot tell the difference, because that experience of breathing was not being re-represented. So you might as well not have breathed the past 2 minutes. Yet we know that you did, right? You would have passed that. Well, maybe not. I could hold my breath for 4.5 minutes once.
No way, I definitely
But
couldn't. So you can
once
assume
upon
I've
a
been breathing.
time, 20 years ago, when I was very much into diving,
Oh yeah, I
um,
was a diver too, but still, no way.
um, we can talk about that. It's a part
Yeah,
of my
yeah.
life that I miss.
Oh, I would love to talk about that. I missed that experience of being underwater. So there has to be an ego
The
to be
reporting
conscious?
ego.
A reporting ego to be
Yeah, the
conscious? I thought you
executive
don't.
ego, the reporting ego cannot tell the difference between the absence of experience and the absence of re-representation of the experience.
Okay, but the child or the body that's come into the world doesn't necessarily have a sense like an ego yet, but it's
But
still
apparently,
experiencing, it's still conscious, right?
well, according to the research you quoted in the very beginning, from 5 years on, they have a reporting ego. And
Right, but
that's
that's
how
the
they
whole
can
point.
report on their
Until
own
five
experience.
years, they don't, but they're
Yeah.
still conscious,
But,
which is what you kind of
yeah,
make a case for. So for me, that means you can't really dissociate it from the body. Once you start with calling it a subject or it calling itself a subject, you're starting that process. But just even if we start in the womb, wherever you want to start, the body's encounter, which I'm saying is sensory through what all parts, all senses, you can choose one. The eyes, the nose, whatever, the skin, proprioception, that sensing for me feels like, or whatever we want to call it, experience and consciousness.
that's not
Yeah.
the only type of experience. You can also have experience without intentional content, experience that is purely endogenous. But just to finally answer your previous question, the reporting ego cannot see a difference between unconsciousness and experience that is not re-represented. But obviously there is. In one case, something is being experienced. In the other case, it's not. You were experiencing your breathing for the prior 2 minutes. It's different than if there were no experience of breathing at all. Now, for how can we gain? We know this objectively in cases like blind sight and other cases that you see in the no report paradigm in neuroscience, which sort of began in 2015 with Tsuchiya. Um, you can see these cases where there is this dissociation between experience, raw experience, and reportability. But to gain direct first person insight into it, one has to pay attention to one's own inner life. For instance, to me, many years ago, there was a moment I realized that I knew something that I didn't know I knew. Not only that, I had known it for years before.
Can you tell me what, or it's too? Because I know what you mean, but
No, it has to do with the life of somebody else.
okay.
So I don't mind telling you everything about my life, but
No, I understand. I wouldn't want to do that either. But
there
maybe
was
so
something,
yeah, you just recognize that you'd been operating with that knowledge.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or, okay, this I can talk more directly about. I can go for a couple of days in pain without knowing that I am in pain.
Mm.
And then when my attention finally falls onto the pain and I re-represent it, then retroactively I know, oh, I have been having this experience for the past couple of days. But during those days, I didn't know I had it. Another experience you can have in dreams, we know this from a study by Jennifer Vint and others years ago, 2007. Dreams tend to be a lot less metacognitive than waking life. In dreams, we tend to experience without knowing that we are experiencing. And that's precisely the reason why absurd things can happen in dreams without alarming us. It's because we're experiencing absurd things, but we're not telling ourselves that we're experiencing them. So it doesn't trigger that rational processing. Wait a moment. How can this be happening? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So these are ways in which you can satisfy yourself from a first person point of view that there can be such a thing as experience in the absence of reportability or meta consciousness.
It reminds me
Now,
of sometimes when you're walking down the street, of course you're seeing everything, but you're not aware that you're seeing it. Do you know what I mean?
mhm.
Like, it just reminds me the other day, someone asked me where something was, and I had no idea I knew where it was. But once they asked the question, I'd somehow seen that, even though I
Yeah,
didn't know I'd seen it.
if you commute a lot by car, if you drive frequently to work or back home, sometimes you arrive in your garage and you realize you don't remember how you got there. You don't remember the drive at all. Were you unconscious during the drive? Of course not. You were conscious, but you're not metacognitive of the experience of driving because you're mulling your problems or you were thinking about something else. It doesn't mean that you were unconscious of your driving, it only means that you didn't re-represent it. And by the way, memory formation has a lot to do with re-representation. Things that we don't re-represent, we don't remember. We don't form memory pathways to lead us back
Yeah,
to
this
that.
is so fascinating. I'm glad you brought that example up because I think that's a great example. And the thing, maybe this can unpack what I'm confused about or what I'm trying to bring up here, because like in that, when we all know that feeling of driving or even walking and you're so to speak lost in thought, you really don't remember it. But then you do come back online. So you kind of can say, yeah, I was there obviously because I moved from point A to point B and here I am and so on. But that was still consciousness, obviously. Well, I guess what I'm saying is we start that way. In that state, we don't have all this kind of language attached to our habits and thought and images and so on, probably because we've just kind of entered. But for me, that's a similar state. It's still consciousness. So is that different for you? The baby being born and the
No, it's experience. It's
yeah,
consciousness.
yeah,
It's not
okay,
meta
okay.
consciousness,
The
but it's
difference is that you
consciousness.
come back online and you know that A and B are connected from where you started to where you are, and the
Yeah,
baby's kind of still developing how to come back online or to how to come online at all.
uh, the meta consciousness is coming online. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And would you say that's kind of dissociation in your use of that term? Consciousness
No,
dissociating from itself?
no, because there was, for in the case of an infant, there was never an association to begin with. So we
But
cannot speak of a
there's
dissociation.
consciousness, right? And then your mom and dad tell you your name and you start to realize, oh, you start to see that other people see you as a subject and then you see yourself as a subject. To
Yeah.
me, that feels a lot like dissociation before there was something like you don't need the subject to know it was a subject for the dissociation to occur, which I feel like you prove in other ways or you lay out very well in another sense, but maybe I'm confusing this
Yeah,
nestedness.
phenomenologically, I understand why you are tempted to use the word dissociation. Technically, I wouldn't use it because it doesn't refer to the same mechanisms that we allude to when we talk of dissociation. For instance, under IIT, dissociation has to do with the exclusion principle of integrated information theory, and it's not related to what you said. But phenomenologically, I understand the temptation.
Well, it's still the same regularities if you want to think mathematically, right? The body is still the same regularities when it comes into the world. Of course, they're changing like over time and growing and so on, but there's a pattern of regularity that's still the same that then becomes aware of itself. So that pattern of regularity to me is sort of dissociated from itself in order to become aware of itself. This is
Oh,
very Hegelian
okay, I
sounding
understand what you
now,
mean.
but
Okay, I understand what
yeah,
you mean. Yes, yes, because I think when the infant is not metaconsciousness, metaconscious, there is no dissociation. It's just the infant being the infant, experiencing the world without re-representing its own experiences, without recognizing itself as a subject distinct from its experiences. The infant is in what Freud called the oceanic consciousness, a
right, or
state of
pure consciousness
selflessness.
even, or some kind of,
Yeah.
there's a form or regularity to it, but yeah.
Yeah, there is a quality to that. And then when you start developing meta consciousness, you start it's like you created the mechanism of attention, and evolutionarily, that's a very precious resource. What you place your attention on mobilizes a lot of cognitive resources, so that has to be used sparingly. And what happens is that when you're paying attention to something, everything that is not in your field of attention sort of falls away out of metacognition. And metacognition has a glow. It has a psychic strength. That it obfuscates everything else that is not being metacognized. Like if you tend to ruminate a lot, so you place your attention to your thoughts in your default mode network.
It's
Um,
beautiful to say it has a glow because it is like that. It's almost kind of it's almost like heightening itself or something.
Yeah, it's like the sun in the noon sky. It has a glow that obfuscates the other stars. The other stars are still there. Their photons are still impinging on your retina. That
Mhm.
impingement is still creating electromagnetic impulses that will go to your visual cortex, to V1. But you are not explicitly aware of the stars because the glow of the sun obfuscates everything else. The same with the field of attention, the field of metacognition. It obfuscates everything else. It's a very precious evolutionary resource. So it has to be used sparingly because of that. And as a consequence, there is a lot of stuff going on in our minds that we cannot be metaconscious of because it would take our eyes off the ball of survival, if you know what I
Mhm.
mean.
Oh
It's
yeah. Oh,
impossible
it
for
would
us
be
to,
overwhelming.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I
So,
mean,
and that's the reason why there's a lot more going on in our phenomenal consciousness than the reporting ego will ever know.
yeah, it's like this blooming, buzzing confusion thing, right? You're just
Yeah.
sort of totally immersed in it. And I think when people do when we do psychedelics or something, we get a little hint of that again, of
Mm.
that we haven't patterned our regularity. So we're just, whoa. And it is kind of too much. You can't really go shopping like that at the grocery store because you get completely amazed by the broccoli or
Yeah.
something, you know?
And if you
It
look at the
doesn't work for normal
psychedelics
life.
too,
So, hmm?
if you look at the mechanism of action of psychedelics, what is the main feature that we observe in the brain of a person under a psychedelic drug? Lots of things happen, but the main, most obvious, measurable thing is a reduction in brain activity, especially in the default mode network, which has to do with this looping mechanisms of attention. That activity is repressed. So you have a solar eclipse, and suddenly you can see the stars at noon, but the stars were always there.
Yeah, exactly. It's beautiful. It's a incredible kind of thing to contemplate. But speaking of that, I would like to know when you started to contemplate it. Like, when did you, uh, as a child, begin to, I won't say dissociate from yourself because that's too, doesn't sound right, but in the sense that I just meant, start to become aware of yourself as a subject? Become
Oh,
metaconscious, I guess.
yeah. I
Do you
think I was
remember?
around 9 years old. I remember it clearly because it was a major moment, a major development in my life, an anomaly. For 6 months or so, um, the thought would come to me like, "Oh wow, I am not the world. I
Oh,
am
wow.
not the houses, the trees, the other people. I'm not that. I am here, and that stuff is there. I am not that." And I experienced this thought as an amazing thing, uncanny, incredible.
Like
And I
very
would have
exciting,
this,
kind of. Yeah.
well, it's like I couldn't believe it, but it had to be true. And I
Like
would
almost
get
like you
this,
were seeing some kind of alien creature or something, or
yeah,
that
like
kind of a thing.
worse than that.
Worse than that.
I would get a cold shiver going down my spine, a very
Oh, yeah.
physical feeling, like you feel that electric vibration that
I
traversing
know
your
exactly what you
spine
mean.
downwards.
Hmm.
And for a period of 6 months or so, every time I would have the thought, I would feel this electric
Wow.
thing, like an uncanny, amazing stuff.
I know
And then
exactly what
I
you mean. Yeah.
habituated and it became normal.
Do you have any idea what could have started that? Did you? I mean, I know it's almost impossible, but you don't remember, like, is it because for me, I remember it was my brother being brought home from the hospital that I started to realize, I guess because it changes the family dynamics. And I mean, I just remember him, the way it looked, like the light kind of on him. They put him on the floor in his little, whatever you call these little things you carry babies around in. and,
Yeah.
and he was just sitting there in the light. And it was just kind of this weird moment of, oh, that's not me.
Mm.
Uh, and it felt like what you described, this
How old were you?
almost too much, you know. I was 3. He's 3 years younger than me.
It happened very early for you. Jung had it at 9. He wrote about it in his
Oh, really?
autobiography. Sorry,
Huh.
Jung had it at 11. I had
Oh,
it at
okay.
9. Um,
Yeah,
it's a
think I
very uncanny realization. If you ask me what brought it about, I think it was just culture. You get you're absorbed into the culture and you start believing in the cultural narratives. And the cultural narratives tell you the absurdity that you're separate from the world, which is, of course, absurd under any metaphysics, idealism, physicalism, dualism, maybe not, but under any monism, it is absurd.
hmm.
But the whole culture operates under this absurdity that we are separate
Yeah.
from the world.
But do you think it does some kind of work for us that, because what we're talking about now is also really important in our lives in terms of, at least to me, like that moment was scary, and it's kind of been awful in a way to wake up to the fact that you've been told who you are, and then you have to figure out what that story was that everyone told you, and then figure out if you really want to be that story, like this whole thing. But at the same time, all of that was the reason I could now look back at that story and change it. Do you know what I mean? And also be kind of present and aware and in the world in a particular way. So,
There's
yeah.
an obvious evolutionary advantage for our identifying ourselves as a subject apart from the world, because if we didn't, we wouldn't care for our survival.
Mhm.
If we are the tiger that is coming to eat us and the tiger is hungry, well, the tiger's got to eat and off we go. So it's evolutionarily advantages, and it's no wonder that a culture evolved around this evolutionary advantage. Is it true? No, no. Unless you are a dualist, it cannot be true. It's just not true. It's useful, but it's a convenient fiction.
But don't you think there's something to that too, that it's very hard to really grasp that in the same way we were talking about earlier of we can't really sense all there is in the world because it's too overwhelming. I think there's something about that realization that can be really difficult, right? That in both ways, like it can be difficult because you want to believe the story that you've kind of created of yourself or that you're different from everyone else. But it can also be different because it just sort of throws into question all other things that you've assumed to be true in
Can you give
terms
me an
of,
example?
well, I guess I'm thinking more about people who would hold very tightly to a scientific worldview like materialism, or to, because you want to know the truth and you want to know there's definite separations between things. And it can be very unsettling to try to think of that differently if you've learned that paradigm, right? It can feel, this is why people get so angry about it, right? And they think they call it all kind of names and stuff because the language itself has already separated those things to the point where it's even hard to talk about without getting someone angry if they've built their worldview on that separation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There is, of course, the psychological dynamics underlying the development of physical, which is very easy to understand. The psychological payoff of physicalism is clear. It's historically visible and it's present today for the same reasons. But it comes at a price, as you're saying. So we have this payoff, as you were saying, we have a payoff. I think the payoff goes beyond just getting used to it. I think the payoff has to do with dealing with death, because if you're a physicalist when you're dead, then there is nobody there to experience what happens afterwards. And the fear of what people will experience after they die is what allowed, for instance, an institution without an army like the Catholic Church to completely control the continent of Europe for 1,000 years. So that has been the single greatest fear of humankind. What will I experience after I'm dead? And that greatest fear in history is off the table with physicalism.
Reminds me
In,
too of that shiver feeling, right? Because that's part of it too. When you start to realize you're not the world as you realized as a little kid, you kind of soon have to realize
you come to an end.
you come to an end and
Yeah,
things you love come to an end. And
that's the price
yeah,
we pay. The price
yeah.
we pay is nihilism. So it's the absence of meaning. This is a secondhand quote, but I was giving an interview the other day, and the host quoted Yuval Harari as saying, "Life has no meaning. All it can give you is drugs and video games." So that's a respected historian. He's not a neuroscientist. He's not a philosopher. So he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's repeating the mantra of the mainstream. So he deserves forgiveness for that. He's not an expert in the field. But the mantra he repeated reflects the price, the psychological price we pay. But the gain overcomes that price, or at least historically, since middle of the 19th century, the gain has been stronger than the price we pay. That dynamics is changing now because we now take the gain for granted. We no longer realize that our absence of fear about what will happen after we are dead. We fear the process of death. We don't fear what will happen after. That is not a given. That is actually derived from a certain metaphysical position called physicalism, which is entirely untenable. It's the greatest bullshit ever to be taken seriously by any rational culture in the history of the planet. But we take it for granted. So we think it's banked, it's in the pocket already. And now the problem we have to deal with is nihilism, is the meaning crisis, as John Vervaeke put it.
Yeah, this is really powerful because, first of all, we need to go back because there was a time when you did buy into all this, right? Or not even buy into all of it, but you were sort of
Well,
materialist and physicalist and so on.
well,
Or
by inertia, because
yeah,
everybody
yeah,
around me
exactly.
was, and I was not really paying much attention to metaphysics. I wanted to do physics, and now my first job was at CERN, and I was much preoccupied with the Higgs boson and SUSY supersymmetry. I
Wonderful.
didn't have cycles left in my processor to worry about metaphysics, but I never was a physicalist thinkingly, in the sense that I never affirmed physicalism out of a conclusion that I arrived at myself through my own thinking process. The
Okay.
moment I started
Yeah.
explicitly thinking about that, it became rather quickly clear to me that physicalism is entirely untenable.
So I want to think about. I think of you as already like a little philosopher in a way because I know the story about you finding Jung because you tell it. The I Ching, which already you were being drawn to the I Ching, and then of
I
course you
didn't know
had.
what the I Ching was,
Yeah,
actually.
but
This
you
subject,
noticed it. We were just talking about the glow of metaconsciousness. So obviously there were zillions of books there, or not. There were probably a lot of other opportunities, and you focused on that one. And
yeah.
then Jung did the preface, and you focused on that. So to me, that sounds like a little bit of a person who's a little philosophically inclined. And I know there's reasons for that, and maybe we can go into it, like for why you that book and that time period. But what's interesting to me is I saw these really cool computers that you're making. These like I can't remember all their names, but they're so cool, like retro, weird microprocessors that kind of are wiring themselves, and they just look wonderful. And so I read like one of your blogs on there, and it says that when you were a kid, you really wanted to build a computer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I really want to understand that, unpack that part of you a bit, because for me, coming out of philosophy and neuroscience and so on, there's this computational mind and everything's a computer. And it sounds like you would have been in that mindset of, okay, if you're trying to understand the world, but you're obviously really drawn to computers and you wanted to create a computer. So, and you were philosophically inclined. So I'm trying to, were you assuming maybe if you understood how to make a computer, you would understand intelligence in a way?
Oh, definitely. I actually didn't change my mind about that yet. I
Okay.
think intelligence is an objectively measurable property. It's about how cleverly you can manipulate data in order to solve a problem. That does not require the presence of a private conscious point of view accompanying those computations that we refer to as
That's
intelligence.
wonderful. I mean, I want you to keep going, but that's exactly what I was hoping to try to unstick. Intelligence, cognition, and consciousness mind. These also get kind of lumped together. But
Uh,
first,
co-
please, like the computer.
Cognition is a strange word
It
because it
is. Yeah.
seems to require awareness. Intelligence, I think
It's
we
better.
can
Yeah.
decouple it from awareness
I
completely.
agree. Yeah. But so why so you wanted to build a computer, and can you was that disappointing in some way, or was it wonderful and then you just decided, oh, now I'm going to kind of start thinking about philosophy? Or I know you went back and got your philosophy degree. It's super cool that you did that, and I saw that you put your defense online, which is just really cool that you did that. uh, just as someone who went back to school a little bit later, I think it gives people, it's a good gift that you're giving. Yeah, but so what happened? Like, why couldn't you figure it out with the computer, or are you still figuring it out with the computer, the intelligence part?
Yeah, well, I have a workbench here behind me
Yeah, I
over
see it.
there,
Looks great. Yeah.
where I design and restore computers. I restore old computers and design brand new computers.
It's
Um,
so cool. And it's just, I guess you're kind of an anomaly for me in a way, because I don't often come in contact with people who are so much connected to the computers, and also would start analytic idealism. Like, to me, that's holding, it's wrong. It's not true. It's not holding opposites in any way, because, as you know, mind and matter and all these intelligence, but it's something very deep to already understand early on,
I
right?
see what you mean. You see a
Yeah.
seeming contradiction there, a dichotomy.
At least the world would be telling you so.
Yeah, I'm not going to attempt to give you a neat story that brings it all together in a very
No, well, it wouldn't
plausible
be true
way,
probably.
because
So
I don't have that neat story myself. I harbor contradictions within myself, and this is one of them. I love to play with the purely mechanistic aspect of a computer, because a computer is entirely reliable in the sense that it's predictable. If you know what you're doing, the computer will do what you want it to do,
mhm.
unless you made a mistake. If it's not doing what you wanted it to do, you made a mistake. There is a clarity to that, that I love. And I think you are right. The quality, the feeling tone associated with designing incredibly complicated mechanisms seems to be dichotomous with the feeling and the tone of contemplating the great metaphysical questions. If that is a dichotomy, I harbor that dichotomy in me, and I shall make no attempt to reconcile.
I actually don't think it's a dichotomy, because dichotomy, is like cutting things apart. And I actually think we've cut it apart in a way that, like, in a way similar to the way materialism and these other things have sort of cut things apart in order to understand them. And the way that you just described the computer, I guess what I'm trying to connect there is because all this for me is more like a paradox that you can hold and even learn something from, and then you realize it's not a paradox, kind of in a wider sense. It's not something that you can cut in half, because then it's not the thing anymore. So it's not a dichotomy, it's beyond it. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is you were literally modeling things, right? You were working in some of the best places that were modeling things as scientists, and you were trying to create computers. That's like what I really think of as representation of modeling to understand. And there's a kind of control and an agency that is very attractive, and would, for me, be a reason why we might end up with that quote that you just gave. Like, if you take that too seriously, and that becomes the only way you can know truth or know what's real. If you
Ah,
can model it, then you end up with everything is material in that way. Do you know what I mean?
not necessarily. I think the problem there is that we mistake our models for reality. We mistake our theoretical entities, which are convenient fictions. We mistake them for the ontological structure of the world. And there is nothing in science that requires that. All that is required in science is that you develop convenient fictions in terms of which you can make correct predictions about what nature will do next. The convenient fictions themselves do not need to be true, and they have never been true. For instance, Um, there was a time in the Middle Ages when scientists were trying to account for, well, that's pre-scientific thought, proto-scientific thought. They were trying to account for electrostatic attraction. Why would amber be pulled into a rod of, sorry, why would shaft be pulled into a rod of amber if you rubbed that rod of amber? So they hypothesized that there is this elastic, invisible substance called the fluvium, which is like a sticky, like chewing gum connecting the shaft to the rod of amber. And when you release the shaft, it just gets the elastic pulls the shaft back to the rod. Never mind the fact that this couldn't at all account for electrostatic repulsion, only for attraction, and that we could never measure this effluvium directly. We only could measure its effects. Later on, we kept on playing the same game. When Faraday came around and he proposed electromagnetic fields, here again was something that was only known insofar as its effects. The field is a modeling tool. We never grab the field. All we can do is measure its effects, like just like we could measure shaft going flying to a rod of amber. And then we replaced those uh, the electromagnetic fields of Faraday. Well, we still have one, but now we have 17 quantum fields, and we can only know about their existence because of their effects. We have no direct access to the fields themselves. In other words, all this stuff are convenient fictions. Newton postulated this invisible force that acted at the distance between celestial bodies and brought them together, called gravity, an invisible force acting instantaneously at a distance. The French laughed of Newton for 50 years because they thought invisible forces acting at a distance, it's woo-woo, it's magical stuff. And sure enough, around came Einstein and said, bullshit, there are no such invisible forces. What there is the invisible fabric of space-time that bends and twists. And now with loop quantum gravity, no, 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 it's not that. There is some other convenient fiction. So we have always created convenient fictions that help us predict what nature will do next. And these convenient fictions have never been true in and of themselves. They are just modeling tools. You become a physicalist when you mistake a convenient fiction for a truth. That's the error you make.
Or even a model for the thing
Yeah,
being modeled, which is something I think happens a
correct.
lot. Right, which is what I was actually trying to get to. It's wonderful that you went there because it's exactly that confusion of map and territory, or um, the model with what we're trying to model, that I think has become very hard to see for a lot of people. Does that make sense to you? And
Absolutely. I think this permeates society at all levels, not only in science. It permeates, for instance, our political views. We have a model of what's going on, and we take that model for reality and we act accordingly. Even at geopolitical levels, for instance, arguably the greatest evildoer in the world today, our present age's Hitler, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. um, he engages in mystical thinking. That's very easy to see based on his pronouncements, the way he talks about history, the way he talks about Mother Russia today and the future of the Slavic peoples. He is taken over by mystical thinking. He takes, uh, for instance, the entity Russia, he takes it to be a real entity that is somehow separate from its people. And that's why he can throw the Russian people to the front lines as cannon fodder and have them all killed, because that's for the benefit of this other entity, Russia, that it somehow is separate from its people. Of course, there is no such entity. Russia exists only insofar as there are Russian people and Russian lands
but I think
in the hands of
this is
Russian
not the
people.
common perception, right? In any country. I mean, I think it really connects to that, the way that we almost assume dualism in a
Of
way.
course,
Or
I mean, look,
yeah.
yeah, somebody I just criticized, I will praise now. Yuval Harari wrote a book about it years ago. Our entire mode of cooperating with other human beings is based on taking fictions for fact. For instance, we believe money has value. Paper, if you burn it, it will give you a cup of calories. It will hardly warm you up. At best, you can clean yourself with it. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, it will not protect you from the elements. It's absolutely valueless. And yet we all go for money because we established this convenient fiction that money has value, and therefore we trade it. We believe in that fiction. Otherwise, why would you give a perfectly good car to somebody in exchange for a pile of paper? Nobody would do that. Everybody has to believe the fiction, otherwise, it wouldn't work. Everybody has to believe in the fictions of nation states. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. We should operationally believe these fictions. But if we believe them ultimately, and now we are making a mistake, because now it's like taking a metaphor way beyond its applicability. Operationally, there has to be the state of the Netherlands. Okay, I don't want that operational belief to disappear. Otherwise, we will be in trouble here as Dutch people. We live in a country in which if we just strike the entire country for a couple of weeks, half the country is underwater. So we
Yeah.
can't do
That's,
that, right? We have to believe in the fiction of the Dutch nation state. Uh, but if we ultimately believe in nation states, in money, and many other, or the theoretical entities of science, now we are fooling ourselves. And it's never a good thing to fool ourselves.
I think what you just said is kind of the most important thing we might all need to learn in a way. And it seems very hard to learn it. And what I mean is that we can model things and we can name things and we can do all the structure and scaffolding via representation, external representation, I mean, not like in our brain. And that's very important, but it's not real in the sense of it's a process. It's just our way of understanding a process, right?
Correct. And look, if people listening to this realize they make this mistake, well, at least you're in very good company because a lot of people with the letters PhD suffixing their names make this mistake, especially science communicators. They make this mistake a lot. They are not even scientists, they are not doing science, they're only talking about it. So they miss out on the subtleties and nuances that practical scientists are confronting every day. People who are actually doing science, they hit upon, they hit with their noses against the limitations of their modeling. They
Yeah.
realize that you
Yeah.
can only stretch a model so far.
But
Uh,
even then, don't you sometimes take it for literal without meaning to? I'm thinking of in neuroscience labs when we look at these pictures of brains with little things lighting up in them. There's a way in which sometimes we really take them as brains. Like it's almost like this is not a pipe, that picture. We need to
yeah,
see that this
yeah.
is not a brain because you just like there's some kind of it's really nuanced and hard not to do this as what I mean in daily life. I think it's even at the root of a lot of meditative practices or the reason we to take psychedelics, some of us who would, like when you're really trying to explore mind, because I think it becomes very hard not to confuse map and territory, I guess is what I'm saying. Because it's so nested and so
That's what
richly
humans do.
interwoven. Hmm?
It's the unique thing about humans is the ability to create a map and then mistake it for the territory. There is one thing that is worse than, at least if we are consistent, we make less mistakes. Even if we believe in something that is not true, but we are consistent in that belief, we make less mistakes. The problem is that often we are not even consistent in a false belief. For instance, it's becoming mainstream in neuroscience now, the understanding that the reality we think we perceive is a modulated hallucination. It is something concocted by the brain as an entity separate from the mind, which is itself already absurd. I think the brain is what the mind looks like. It's not what produces the mind. But let's at least be consistent in that mistake. The brain is an entity that produces the mind, and it's also producing the hallucination that we call the world. That this comes from ideas. Give you one example of a person who talks about it frequently is a new Seth. He talks about
Yeah.
it frequently. Reality being a controlled hallucination. It's a
Mm-hmm.
construction of the brain.
Being You, I guess, is the book, right? That sort of makes that argument in a way
Maybe
from him. Yeah.
who
But
who who did you say?
Anil Seth, his book, I think it's called like Being You. That's it's like a
Oh,
pop.
yeah,
It's a,
yeah,
I
yeah.
just what you're saying really resonates with me because I think it's become. I've seen like younger kids of my friends starting to sort of take this view of it's all a hallucination, and it's very connected to that nihilistic kind of
Well,
sense
i-
too, and it's very
i-
sexy though in a way.
if you go all the way, you make less mistakes because the mistake then people make is to take the brain away from that reality that is hallucinated, is to say that, no, the brain is not a hallucination. Everything else is a hallucination of the brain, but the brain is not. Well, why? The brain is an object, just like everything else. It's something that appears to perception. So if you maintain that the reality we perceive is a hallucination, it's concocted by something, then the brain is part of that hallucination. The brain, too, is being concocted by something. So if you persist in your error consistently, eventually you realize what you did. The problem is that we are not even consistent in that error. And that's when things really become
Yeah,
messy.
is that I took you away, but yeah, so that you were saying like that's how we start taking the map for the territory or confusing the two in a way, right? That makes sense to me that we
Yeah, physicalism is a prime example of this.
yeah, so what is it I guess like to try to go back to you, did I had this kind of narrative I'm just realizing that maybe you were working as a computer in this world, CERN and all this, very successful. I think you started businesses, and I know you were really, really successful. You still are. You're still doing it, which is kind of the realization I'm having now because I know you have this AI thing now. But I'd kind of imagined you'd just gotten sick of it or something and decided, okay, like I'm just going to throw materialism away and go get my PhD and become a philosopher. But of course, I know that it wasn't like that. You were already a philosopher in a way because you were writing these articles like the Scientific American one that I brought up. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, how did all this come together? And did you reject materialism? Was there a moment where you did kind of knowledge by acquaintance of idealism? Or, I mean, was there a moment where it became very clear to you that this story that we've been expressing in different ways was harmful or it needed a counterbalance?
Well, just let me first just address, I think, a suggestion that you made. Maybe you don't, even without intending. The fact that I'm starting another company now, an AI company, it doesn't mean that I'm back to materialism or physicalism.
No, not at all.
Because
That's what I'm saying. I was making this distinction as if those worlds were to you already were holding all these things together, right? Like over time. But I was sort of putting them in as if you chose one. Like suddenly you
oh,
realized, okay, no materialism. Now it's idealism is the way or
yeah.
something.
Oh, okay, that happened. My physicalism has not been a part of my life for many years now. It's a fiction that is lost to time in my
Right, but
narrative.
it doesn't mean computers haven't been, is what I'm
Of
saying. Like
course not. Whether the world
yeah,
is
exactly.
physical or ideal or anything else,
Yeah,
computers
exactly.
exist. This
Exactly.
thing we experience and we call computers still exist, and they are still as cool as they were before, maybe
Yeah, and you're
cooler.
still making them and making
Of
stuff out of
course,
them and yeah,
of
exactly.
course. They
I just it's
perceive
one of
the
those
world.
things like you brought up a minute ago where I didn't know I was thinking that till just now and then I realized, oh,
Yeah, look,
yeah.
for an idealist, the world doesn't cease to exist. It's just that the idealist accounts for that world in a different way, a more sane way. But the world's still there, and I'm still alive, and I'm still up to having fun. That
Yeah, but
didn't
for
change.
people listening, I'm sort of assuming they know, but so we've been talking about this materialist point of view and of course you've started a kind of revolution, I guess, around like metaphysical idealism, right? Because not too long ago, it was just like, oh yeah, everything is monist, everything is physicalist, everything is materialist. You don't talk about consciousness. You don't talk about you basically. I'm talking in the scientific circles, right?
Yeah.
And now that's changed a lot for a lot of different reasons. But so just for people listening, they probably already know, but that's what I'm trying to bring up here is this obviously you weren't satisfied with materialism and I'm trying to understand kind of why.
Yeah. Well, when did that begin to happen? When I was at CERN, I was in the early team, the first team that started working on what would become the experiments of the LHC, the Atlas, the CMS, and a couple of other smaller experiments. I was in the Atlas team, And we were
So
doing the
cool.
triggers.
Were you getting shivers then? Like, I mean, was it cool sometimes to just think, okay, I'm here in this world when this is
It was
happening at
incredibly
exactly
cool.
this moment? It's such a wave. You were
It,
just right at the right moment.
yeah, it blew my mind that my
Yeah,
first job was my dream job. Yeah,
it's crazy. Yeah.
I was having I was really in for a ride at CERN. I was when I landed there. I finished my the work experience stage. I finished it there, and then I started as a no. I was officially working for CERN. I was 22.
Oh my God.
Uh, yeah.
So no
Um,
wonder you hardly could were old enough to have thought much about materialism.
Yeah, no, I was having too much fun,
Mm.
working on that. And what we were doing, we're doing the data acquisition system for the calorimeter, one of the detectors in the Atlas experiment. And we needed to have a computer system that was intelligent enough to look at the data coming in and within 25 nanoseconds make a decision. Is this potentially new physics? Is this the Higgs boson? Or is this old physics? Because we had to throw away 98% of the data. The thing produces terabytes per second. So you can't store everything. And even if you could, offline analysis would take lifetimes.
Mm.
So you have to very quickly decide what you want to keep and what you want to throw away. And we developed a system based on our understanding of physics. But in parallel, I developed, with some partners in crime, I developed a neural network, an artificial neural network. Of course, it was the first option that was selected because at the time AI was considered a black box. But we knew that the neural network performed just as well as the
Wow.
physicist's understanding of the data.
And that
And
was
that's what,
not commonly thought at that moment at all, right?
well, people knew neural networks
Okay.
could do a lot. But we didn't have computers fast enough to really bring us beyond just three layers. So feature
Yeah.
extraction we had to do by hand. Now we have deep learning, so you do nothing by hand. The
Right,
network
right.
has multiple layers. It's a different
But
time,
I
but
feel like that was a time when people thought it was limited or kind of had done
well,
its thing or something. Or was this just before that?
mm,
Or
the
no?
main issue we had at the time was one, scalability. We didn't have computers that were fast enough.
Mm,
And
okay.
two, it was considered a black box. We didn't have the visualization tools we have today that show the cuts in the hyperdimensional space where the thing is being evaluated. So you see what the neural network is doing. You see how it is, quote, thinking. At the time, we didn't have that. So we knew it worked, but we didn't know how. And therefore, people felt, no, we can't use this because we don't know how this shit works. Now,
Sounds like today
basically,
it's back to that. It's just gone accelerated to another
yeah,
level. But
well, there is reason to that because it's not enough for you to know that it works in the instances you've given it to him, to the system. If you don't know how it works, then you cannot know that the moment you show it something new, that it will still work because you don't know how it's doing what it's doing. So
Mhm.
we adopted the traditional approach based on our physics understanding of what's going on, um, you know, decay physics based on quantum field theory, the standard model. That's what we went with. But it planted the thought in my head I could make a computer that was as good as a physicist in telling me whether it's a Higgs boson there or not.
Hmm.
What would it take to make it conscious now? And of course, that question is itself based on a physicalist premise, which is consciousness is something created out of material arrangements. And I knocked my head against that wall for a couple of years. And I realized that whatever I did, it would only change structure and function. And it would give me no more and no less reason to think that the thing suddenly became conscious. And I realized that I was facing that dilemma because I made some mistaken assumption at some point. And I traced my steps back, and I got to the point where I understood that the mistaken assumption was that consciousness is something that is created out of material arrangements, even
Wonderful.
though even
Yeah.
the theory that that is the case arises within consciousness. Consciousness is the only given of nature, the only pre-theoretical given. Everything that is not in consciousness is an abstraction. It's not an empirical given like consciousness itself. And when I realized that, and then my physicalism was off the table, and then I experienced an ontological vacuum, like my story in terms of which to relate to reality was gone. I needed another one. It's a very
So
uncomfortable space to
I'm
be.
sorry to stop you, but this is really interesting because when you say that, it's not like you were reading materialist philosophy, or were you? Because you said earlier you didn't really think of yourself as a physicalist. Was it more that you thought you could build out of materials something like consciousness? Yeah. So really, what you were trying to build was something like intelligence in the way you described it
Well,
earlier.
I had succeeded in building intelligence.
Okay.
And the
But you
question
weren't
came,
thinking of it
how
like
do I
that, or
add?
were you? Yeah.
Well, I wanted to know, can I add consciousness to this intelligence that I just
And what
built?
was that? What would be the extra thing that you were adding with the consciousness?
Well, that's the thing I tried to find for years. And I realized that whatever I hypothesized, it would be only about structure and function and never about consciousness. Consciousness either is a miracle or it has to precede all this. And I'm not much for miracles. So I went with consciousness precedes all this. And then you need a metaphysics to account for the fact that there obviously is an external world beyond my consciousness. Clearly, a world that doesn't care whether I like it or not, a world that doesn't care about my morning affirmations or whatever you practice you have to influence the world. How do we account for that? Well, that you account by understanding that consciousness as an ontological type is not only inside your head. Only under materialism or physicalism is consciousness inside your head. Under idealism, if consciousness is fundamental, then it's your head that is in consciousness. But you have to account for the fact that your personal consciousness doesn't know what's happening in China right now and can't change the world merely by an act of volition. So that's why I pursued the path of an objective form of idealism under which there is an external world, but that external world too is made of mental states akin to mine, but they are not mine. They are out there. Just like my thoughts from your point of view. My thoughts are mental states, but they are not in your mind. They are external and objective from your point of view, but they are subjective essentially from their own point of view. Same thing for an external world under idealism. So I built this new story for myself, but I did engage with the
What was
literature.
the moment of crisis though? I still don't really understand because it wasn't just that you couldn't build a conscious computer, was it? Because you said you had to rethink your whole worldview. So
Yes.
was it what was the real crisis there?
The crisis was that in understanding that physicalism didn't hold any water, because I pursued the literature as well, and I realized that the literature in physicalism is basically a set of promises. It's
So no
promise
matter
after
how many
promise.
models you make, you're never gonna
No, you're not going to create
understand
consciousness
the
out of
nature of the world.
unconsciousness, because consciousness is there to begin with. Now, what you have to find is what are the boundaries of the dissociative processes within consciousness? Because clearly I am one. I can't read your thoughts. Presumably you can't read mine. So I'm dissociated from you. So finding the boundaries of the dissociation is the next challenge. And we have no reason to think that the silicon computer represents those boundaries. We do have reason to think that metabolism represents those boundaries. So living beings have private, dissociated, conscious points of view of their own. Computers don't. That was the ultimate conclusion. But it took me years to get there, engaging with the literature. I read the physicalist literature. I read the literature on subjective idealism, Berkeley's idealism, which I thought was entirely dissatisfying, unsatisfying.
But you like
The
Schopenhauer, but obviously not Hegel, huh?
I think Hegel was a wise man, but a dysfunctionally arrogant man to the point of making himself impossible to understand unless you already know in advance what he's trying to say. And then you recognize what he's trying to say. But if you don't know it in advance, Hegel is not going to help you
I think,
because,
I mean, we won't go on a tangent about Hegel, but I think if you separate the man from the work, which I know we can't do fully, um, but I think there's a practice. Like when you're reading it, you kind of get this understanding, I think, of the kind of thing he's trying to describe. So for me, there's a kind of a way in which you can get it before you get it reading him. But I know I see your point. And Schopenhauer is, definitely going towards idealism in a very different way that I know you
oh,
do.
he's a flat out
Yeah.
idealist, an
Yeah.
objective idealist, not alien, just like
Mm.
me. I'm also an objective idealist.
Yeah. So, but you were already reading Jung, right? I mean, So
since very
we've
early.
we've reached this moment where you, I mean, of course, we're a cartoon. It's a little bit of a cartoon, but you've kind of realized materialism is wrong, and so there must be idealism, and it must, and then you're gonna work it out in your new PhD into analytical idealism.
Well,
But
I published many books before I
yeah,
decided
and
that,
many
okay, I'm going to
papers,
get a
and
second
but
PhD.
I'm just that's why I said it's a cartoon, because of course, like, your whole life goes into this, right? But it's also not true that you were just kind of a materialist, because, like, we didn't explain it, but I brought up the I Ching that you found when you were, what, 12 or 14 or
14.
12, 14, in the bookshop, and there was a preface by Jung, and I want to know what about that preface caught your attention. Because
Uh,
Jung to me feels very much closer to the realizations you were having later. I don't know if that's true or not, but relative to, there must be something that's not material.
oh, Jung is flat out an idealist, but that's something you understand after you read his entire collected works, maybe a couple of times. So that realization came much later in my life. When I was 14, I just read his preface to the I Ching, and I didn't know what the I Ching was. It had a nice cover with lots of these hexagrams, and I
It's funny,
picked
I'm
up that.
imagining it, right? With, like, I'm imagining it green with, like, gold little sparkles on it or something. I have no idea why. It's
No,
very
it was
weird that.
blue with yellow hexagrams, but it
Oh,
was a
very nice.
particular edition. There are so many
Too bad you
editions
don't
of
still
it.
have it, or do you? No.
I do have it.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. That's
Uh,
amazing.
it's not here. Here are the books I actually use. The
Yeah.
books I no longer use are stashed somewhere else.
That's wonderful you still have it, though. That's like a continuity through time. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so how did you, because I can't imagine it. I mean, I also liked Jung very young, and I don't really know why I did, but I wonder if you remember what about
Yeah,
it
I remember
talked
exactly
to you.
what caught me. I realized that that book was an oracle, a means to do divination, to predict the future. And that to me was absolutely ridiculous. It
That's a
was
beautiful thing, what you just said. I don't know what you mean at all, though. How did you realize it's an oracle?
you just s- flip the pages, and I think
But
Jung
his
himself,
preface or the I Ching,
you
or
just
both?
open the book anywhere you want, and you find a hexagram, a description of it, and what it might mean for the current configuration of time, and what it might mean for the future configurations of time. Under the I Ching, time has qualities. It's not a neutral arrow. Each moment in time has a certain quality and favors certain events and disfavor other events. So it's an oracle, and it was clear to me very quickly just by flipping the pages. This is a bloody oracle. Um, and I thought that was ridiculous. Oracles are ridiculous, right? Then I read the preface, and Jung gives a rationalist hypothesis for why we shouldn't just laugh at oracles. It may not be the what we think it is. We sort of regard oracles as something flatter and less sophisticated than how Jung understands an oracle to be. But it was a rationalist account based on the notion of synchronicity, and what he basically says is that there are two orthogonal organizing principles in nature. One is causality, and okay, that one has nothing to do with oracles, but the other one is synchronicity, in which things that are similar in meaning tend to occur together. And I realized this is an empirical question. This is not logically fallacious. It may be untrue, but it's an empirical question. It's something that can be tested. And with that disclaimer in place, his account is a rationalist account. So here's a guy who just gave me a plausible rationalist account of a bloody oracle.
Was it associated with sort of spirituality and woo-ish kind of
No, no,
can't
no.
take
There
it
is
true, or
no,
just
no, there is nothing
what was it
that
about
there
an oracle that you didn't trust till you read that, I guess? That just couldn't happen, or
But the story that time has qualities, that different moments in time favor different things. It was something I couldn't take seriously until I read the preface. And I don't know why I decided to read the preface, because very quickly, just by flipping the pages, I thought, what the hell is this? And then there was this preface, and I thought, my God, it's possible to give a rationalist account, which may be untrue, but it is a rational, it's not illogical, it's a rational account of a hypothesis that may give some substance to it. And by the way, it can be empirically verified. So that sort of made me realize that Jung was a source of insights that opened doors in my mind.
Hmm. It sounds like you've done, what you just described, what you've attempted to do. Maybe I heard you say it, or maybe I'm projecting or something else. But what you just described was he'd kind of laid out a way that people, you in this situation, could logically, coherently, with robustness, understand something that had seemed like it needed to just be dismissed, right? Which
Exactly.
is kind of what you do with analytic idealism. Lay out the idea that the whole world can be mined, which is something a lot of people have dismissed, and you do it very rigorously with
Yes.
all, yeah.
Yes. It made me understand that we have to look for our hidden, unexamined assumptions every time we dismiss something on a logical basis. If we dismiss something purely because it seems illogical, you immediately have to subject that conclusion to criticism by hunting for all the assumptions you are unknowingly making and which base that conclusion. So that's what Jung taught me very early, that we have to try to examine our hidden assumptions,
That's
assumptions
so
that we don't even
powerful.
know we
I'm
are
sorry.
making.
That's so powerful in the context of everything we've been talking about, right? Because taking this nihilistic or materialist worldview seriously that has become not a means to understand the world, like a model of the world, but rather the state of the world, I think kind of comes out of what you were talking about, the fear of death and the fear of all these things that we're not supposed to explore, not only death, but also that what we were talking about before too, that there might be so much we don't see and understand around us because we can't handle it yet, so to speak.
Yeah, we live in our own fictions. We mistake our fictions for reality. And certainly in physicalism, but in everything else as well. And hunting for unexamined assumptions is very difficult because they are precisely the things that you tend to not look at, that you tend to take for granted. You don't even know you're making those assumptions. Physicalism is riddled with unexamined assumptions. And it's not only a psychological dynamic that physicalism became mainstream, it's changing now. It's not going to be mainstream for much longer. I don't think even in my lifetime it will remain mainstream because something that is illogical and empirically untenable just cannot survive for very long. It's just that our lives are very short. But it doesn't survive many centuries. There are other reasons why physicalism became mainstream. And look, what I'm about to say is not a conspiracy theory. I'm not saying there is a cabal that knowingly enforces the fallacy of physicalism. No. But it was a game of social dominance and also that propelled physicalism forward because since the 17th century, the elites that eventually became the bourgeoisie towards the end of the 18th century, they vied for social dominance against the clergy, the church, which had been the dominant social group for 1,000 years before, well, more than 1,000 years, all the way deep into scholasticism. And then this new sort of scholarly commercial class that became the bourgeoisie in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they started vying for dominance against the church. And in the beginning, the church was more powerful. They burned Bruno at the stake.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
they could kill one another. But around the time of the July Revolution in 1830 or so, um, what was now really the bourgeoisie was in a position of advantage against the church. And how do you apply the coup de grace? How do you win the war? Is by pulling the rug from under the church, from under the feet of the clergy. And the way to do that is to say what the church busies itself with, which is psyche, a Greek word that means mind, but also means spirit. Or something religious, metaphysically distinct from the physical. By that point, uh, uh, physis and psyche were already in the early 19th century. They were equivalent. Goethe is on record saying that You got to be an idiot to not recognize that everything in nature must have a physical side and a mental side, a
Mm.
psychic and a physics side. So they were at equivalent. So the bourgeoisie were no longer losing, but they wanted to win. And how do you win? By saying psyche derives from physics. So psyche is secondary, matter is primary. So what the church busies itself with, mind, spirit, that's secondary. They are busying themselves with derivative stuff. And we, the scientific scholarly bourgeoisie, embodied by people like Darwin, even Goethe himself was a bourgeois avant la lettre. He was the son of a financially independent lawyer, and he was ennobled by the Duke of Weimar, but he was not an aristocrat by birth. They by pushing by peddling this notion that psyche was secondary and matter was primary, they completely won the war over social and cultural dominance over the clergy. And before the 19th century was over, that dominance was clear. It was very clear to Nietzsche, who chronicled that period while living through it and famously proclaimed that God is dead and the basis for all of our morals would have to be revised and
Mm.
people would have to find a new meaning in life, not based in transcendence anymore, because after
God is
all,
dead is the famous quote. Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, this is I'm putting it probably through a Hegelian lens now that I've brought up Hegel, but it sounds very Hegelian to me in a way, or I'm trying to rationalize it or understand it because it sounds, you could think of that, and it's been told in a lot of historical tales of the church just had too much power because all the mystery, all the death, all the kind of wonder was in control of the
the
church, and
priests.
most people couldn't read, and so they just had a monopoly on that part of the world, which in a way gave people a way to still partake in that part of the world because they could just be told what it was and how to
Yeah,
do it. But then so then you need almost not need, but I can understand like that then scientists, people who are looking into matter or building machines to try to better understand things, would almost need to take that power away in a sense because what they're really looking at is that stuff, even if they don't say that's what they're
yeah,
looking
but
at.
this is usually how it happens in history. You know, if you're a student of history, you see this happening again and again. The movement starts based on a very noble cause. The church is reserving for itself a power it doesn't deserve, doesn't it intrinsically shouldn't have, because the priesthood made themselves necessary intermediaries between the people and the answers to the great questions. The people couldn't have a direct relationship with divinity. So they sort of grabbed that power, and a movement, a resistance movement against it started, which is noble. We should applaud it. But as it so often happens in history, the people who won from the church, instead of giving that power to the people, kept that power for themselves. And psychologically, that has to do with fluid compensation. You know, seeing yourself as distinct from the masses sort of gives you meaning and validation. And that's what the scientific elites did. And today it's still going on. It's not science that has usurped that power, it's scientism.
Mm.
Scientism is not practiced by scientists who are slaving away in the laboratory every day to find cures for diseases and make sense of foundations of physics. No, these are not scientists in the sense of scientism. They are scientists in the sense of practicing science people. Um, Scientism is promoted by the priesthood of so-called science spokespeople. Think of Richard Dawkins, Brian Cox, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Many of these people are not really doing science. Some of them have never done science. Cannot say that about Richard. Um, but they promote a philosophy, a metaphysics that is loosely based on science as a methodology, but which goes way beyond the reach that the scientific method allows you to go in making assertions about reality. And they also tell you what it's all about. And if my previous interviewer, Alex from Skeptical, if he's correct, Yuval Harari is falling for that. He's doing the same thing. He's telling you there is no meaning. All I can give you is video games and drugs. Okay, they are the new priests. It's the winning party usurps that
Hmm.
power for themselves. That's not science. That's scientism. It's
Do you?
metaphysics.
I agree. And do you think it comes almost well? I mean, I brought up Alex before because we talked on Philosophy Babble, which I think you know that show, but and he just wrote this article about it, kind of what you're talking about. I don't know if you've seen it about the Ponzi scheme of science or something.
Oh, I saw it come. I haven't read it
Yeah.
because this is a discussion that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, well, I won't go into that, but I guess what I was going to say is sometimes you start as a scientist as I'm thinking to try to put myself in the position of Noarai, for example. People start coming to you and they need the answer all the time, and the way you've gotten the answer is this materialist way, and it almost becomes that you have to defend it if you're not able to hold the paradox in the way we've been trying to do. Then you almost start defending it to the point where you almost put yourself in a corner to where you can't possibly say, oh, actually, all this other stuff does matter after all. Do you know what I mean? There's some
I know
weird
exactly what you mean.
inertia that people get
Yeah,
stuffed into these places.
there are more hidden discussions than the public gets to see. But look, the science, the representatives of the Church of Scientism, which is a metaphysics, the metaphysics of physicalism, it's only very loosely coupled to science. These guys, they are not, they are as much the deceived as the deceiver. In other words, they are being honest. It's not like they know something else is true, but they keep peddling something they know isn't true. No, they believe the shit they are regurgitating every day in the airwaves. They truly believe that. And at some point, their very sense of identity becomes sort of enmeshed with that. And then you can't pull back anymore. Psychologically, it becomes impossible to pull back. Even when you are in a private discussion in which there are several participants and there is a consensus emerging and the data seems to be very clear and unambiguous, and you're backed into a corner, and if you were really an objective thinker, you would say, well, okay, I have to admit that the weight of the discussion now seems to be shifting to something else. No, no, no. They double down, they triple down, they quadruple down. They will die saying that. It's just human psychology. It has nothing to do with reason and evidence. It's just psychology. It's emotion.
Yeah, and it's hard stuff. I mean, the ego once you make your way, your name through something, you do start feeling like you have to defend it, and it takes a really big person to be able to see that in themselves and admit it and recognize it. I mean, some of the best philosophers and scientists do this, but it's I think can be really hard. But so we've kind of set up we know what's wrong with materialism. What is idealism? Your the world that you've opened, which is I won't say it's the polarity of this, but it's showing this is not the only way we have to go. What is it giving us, or even what does it give you, or what did it give you back then in that moment when you started this shift?
Well, I didn't become an idealist because it gave me something in the sense that it made me feel better. I didn't, I'm too committed to truth for that. I think physicalism is bleak, but if reason and evidence points to it, then we should bite that bullet. The world is bleak, and that's all there is to it. No, I came to
I didn't really
idealism,
mean
and
it gave it to you like made you feel good. I don't think gifts always make us feel good, but I see what you're saying.
it didn't make me feel good at all. On the contrary, to
No,
this day, I still have a hard time reconciling
hard.
myself with the
Yeah.
implications of idealism.
Yeah, I don't
But
think what you're doing is easy, coming
most
up with
people
this,
think that
defending this,
idealism is
saying this.
great.
Yeah.
People think idealism is great. It makes life so much more positive. That's not how I experience it. It makes life meaningful. But it's a tough pill to swallow if you really understand the implications. Idealism was the one narrative that survived my own criticism regarding the empirical evidence we have. Like, obviously, there is an external world that doesn't depend on me, and more detailed empirical evidence from foundations of physics, neuroscience of consciousness, and a rational derivation line, which physicalism doesn't have. Physicalism has some jumps in which you're basically appealing to miracles or to unknowns or to magic, like emergentism in physicalism. Like 10 euros are not conscious, 100 are not, 1,000 are not. But there is some point in which you add 1 euro and boom, there is enough complexity and now it's all conscious. That's an appeal to magic. It's giving a label to an unknown, waving a flag saying emergentism, which has no semantic ground. In other words, it means nothing. You're just talking through your eyes, if you forgive me my 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 imagery. And people are not doing that because they want to deceive. They drink their own snake oil. You know,
Well, you make a really good they make a really good argument, and the argument itself to them feels like it's justified it. So
yeah,
it's not you that because the argument as seems good, right? From that logical point of view, that Aristotelian kind of logical sense, then you can feel good about it. So
yeah.
it
They
doesn't
start
matter
from
that
the
it doesn't make
conclusion.
any sense
Yeah,
in
no, they
real
start
life.
from the conclusion. And if there is an argument line that leads to that conclusion, it doesn't matter how many miracles there are entailed in that thought line. It must be true because it leads to the conclusion that we know, right? Should be true.
Right.
Now,
So you're in this weird
idealism,
circle of proving what you stated or something. I don't
begging
know.
the question, yeah, circular
Yeah, right.
reasoning.
Begging the question.
Idealism gave me a derivation line that requires no miraculous steps. And that's suddenly soothed my eagerness uh, for some narrative that made sense, some model that made sense, that may ultimately proven to be wrong, but based on everything we know now and based on the most objective and sincere reasoning we can deploy, thus survive and thus seem to account for the data. That's what it gave me.
Do you think, I mean, because I guess I don't know if you want to say it better than me, but we could summarize analytic idealism that everything is mental, or then, yeah, how would you'll do
Yeah.
better than me, but
Yeah, everything is mental. In other words, everything is experiential, but not everything is your personal experience. Um, eh, the entirety of nature is constituted of experiential states, but not your experiential states alone. There is a world out there beyond you and me, a world that we inhabit, a world that will still be there after we are no longer around, as these pockets of dissociated mental states that we are while we are living beings. But that world that would survive us, that will survive us, is also constituted of mental states. The mental states that constitute the world appear to us as we colloquially refer to as matter, physical stuff. In other words, the contents of perception. Under idealism, under analytic idealism, which is my formulation of it, perception is like an airplane's dashboard. Imagine that you're flying an airplane that has no windows. All you have are the dials on the dashboard. You can still fly safely. It's flying by instruments. Pilots are qualified to do that every day. The dashboard gives you accurate information about the world, but it isn't the world. It's a representation of the world that doesn't even look like the world. Dashboard indications don't look like the storm outside, the lightning, the shape of the horizon, the shapes of the clouds. But you can fly safely through the dashboard alone. So, under analytic idealism, what we call the physical world, the contents of perception, are dashboard indications. Physicality is not the world as it is in itself. It's a representation thereof, a representation that we, dissociated complexes of the mind of nature, create ourselves, and which are then modulated by the real external states of the world, which are experiential states. So the world is not physical. Physicality is our cognitive representation of the world. And we cannot access the real states of the world directly because we are dissociated from it. That's what life is. Life, biology, metabolism is what a dissociative process in this one field of subjectivity that nature is looks like when represented on a dashboard. A brain is part of what our true experiential inner states look like when they are represented on a dashboard. That's
so
the
mind, consciousness, experience, can we say these are interchangeable in a sense as the primitive?
it's depends on how you
The
want
words.
to
They're
use
just
the
words.
words. Yeah.
What I'm getting at is we were talking about modeling and we were talking about, do you think of language as a model? Do you think that there's other ways to perhaps say what you're expressing without necessarily these same terms? Or are you seeing these kind of terms like mind, consciousness as kind of like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
The possibility that language is already a model. And so are you giving us a kind of way to get there that is only one way, or is it the way?
A conceptual model uses language, and it certainly does that when it needs to be communicated. It may even use language as we are formulating it within ourselves. But there are multiple ways of talking about a model in language, multiple linguistic avenues for trying to express a model. Some of them are metaphorical, some of them are allegorical, some of them are literal, some of them are mythopoetic. So no, I don't elevate language to the level of an ultimate truth. I think it's an operational convenience. It's just one we fall for a lot of times. We mistake language for the thing we are trying to express. So I think analytic idealism, there are many ways in which it can be formulated. I propose a few, but I'm sure others can propose other ways to expand on the exact same model.
So Jung, for example, wasn't talking about analytic idealism in these kinds of terms. And as you show in your book, he's using very different terms. I mean, we didn't get into how something can be unconscious, but this is like really interesting to me. But there's all kinds of ways we can turn this around.
Yeah.
And in a way, Jung is expressing it in a different way. Like you kind of show that in the book. So I guess what I'm trying to open up is that sometimes it feels like we have to choose between all these isms, rather than like we were talking about before, these isms are ways of trying to talk about or model or express what can't necessarily ever be completely 100% modeled or expressed. And I just wonder if that feels comfortable to you, if you think of it like that, or because you could easily get stuck in a corner too where you have to defend, you know, these particulars, but even
Oh,
though you're pointing past the particulars.
yeah, no, I'm comfortable switching language if I find myself in a place where I'm not getting my ideas across properly. I'm very comfortable with switching the language. I mean, different books of mine talk about the same thing in completely different ways. So I've
Yeah, you
been
use a lot of
juggling this.
metaphors, I guess,
I have
sometimes,
used
which are
metaphors in some books, in others, like The Idea of the World, or my latest, which is coming out in October, called Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. I try to be as direct as possible with as little symbolic content as possible. So, no, I'm very flexible about this. What I want people to get is what I mean behind what I say.
yeah.
And the way to do that is to say what I mean in as many different ways as I possibly can so people can distill what is common behind all of those different linguistic approaches.
And that's hard too, because you get called to task by all the people who want to latch on to one thing or the other. But maybe that's interesting too. But because you do, even your book, sometimes you're talking to the people who have the knowledge of reference or conceptual knowledge relative to a certain form of academia where you write papers in a certain way. There's a couple of your books that are like basically like papers, and then other ones which are speaking more the way Jung did. Um,
I
and
try to
that's
meet
kind of
people
holding
where
the
they are.
paradox. Yeah, they're not dichotomies, I guess. Like for me, that's a
No,
service you're giving to show, because I talk about holding the paradox a lot, of like being able to open the space and not smush the things together or dissolve them necessarily, but they don't need to be, they're two different ways of describing the
yeah,
process.
yeah. I think, I deliberately try to avoid neologisms as much as possible, creating new words. And unfortunately, this is very common in philosophy and science as well. And then you get sort of stuck with that word creation of yours. I deliberately avoid that. And what I try to do instead is to say the same thing in as many different ways as possible, because I want people to see past what I'm saying and discern what I mean. That's my way of dealing with this difficulty. But at the end of the day, Andrea, people bring themselves to bear when they absorb a message. And
Mm-hmm.
whatever baggage they have with them, they will bring it to bear in their understanding of the message. That this is unavoidable. It's unavoidable to me when I am on the receiving end. It's
Mm-hmm.
part of our respective journeys. I just do the best I can. But beyond that, we are all responsible.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was sort of getting at, because the way I think of all of this, whatever we're doing, this encountering, living, philosophizing, is we are trying to find a way to understand that perspectivalism of each of us are kind of on a journey, as you said. There's a certain path, and no matter how shared the landscape is, we've seen different things on the path, and we're going to understand whatever this process is and that we're trying to understand. We're probably both going to understand it a little different way, and that's okay. I mean, even though we're sharing similar regularities, but I guess that gets to do you still do you think of things in linear, like beginning and end, or do you see all this as nested in a way, or like how do you think of the kind of all of this? Because the dissociation, for example, can sound like still like we're putting two things against each other, but I feel like it's more they're connected and they're nested. And like I was describing at the beginning about consciousness, we nest out of ourselves into metaconsciousness. And to me, that can also be kind of this. So, yeah, how do you see that linear mindset or?
Look, even in psychiatry, dissociation is not considered a fundamental split. You can have a dissociated patient that gets cured. His dissociation is resolved, and he realizes that all of his dissociated complexes were actually him or her. This happens in psychiatry all the time. Dissociative identity disorder is a very common condition, different degrees, but very common. You talk to any practicing psychiatrist, and he will tell you it happens a couple of times a week in their practice. So no, dissociation does not mean a fundamental separation. It's a cognitive thing. It's an appearance. It's a form of illusion. I think nature is one field of subjectivity. If we eventually get to a unified field theory in which we collapse the 17 quantum fields plus something standing for gravity into one field, I would interpret that as that one field is this field of subjectivity. And the variety and the diversity of the states of nature are just different patterns of excitation of this one field. So even dissociation is a configuration, a local configuration taken on by a segment of this one field. It's never a fundamental separation between us and this one field that nature is.
Yeah, I mean, I have to bring up love because it's love and philosophy. And I guess I'm trying to kind of get towards that in a way that's not sentimental because, or that is sentimental in the way that's authentic because if we can think of it as nested and get away from this beginning and end kind of thing, and we can even bring up this idea of consciousness in the way we were talking about at the beginning, and that what you were saying about it's crazy that we think we're all separate, or you said it in a different way, but it is all it's all when we say it's all one, sometimes it sounds like it has a beginning and an end, but it's all some kind of ongoing process that we're trying to understand. And it seems to me that in a way, these dissociations, you being one of them and me being another, and all the other people, my dog here, and there's all these beings which could be thought of as trying to somehow, not even trying, but part of this process of dissociation in the way that you mean it. And I don't mean it in an unhealthy way, though I think it can become unhealthy, right? I mean, there's a point where it could, but
Anything can become unhealthy.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
matter of degree. Look, if my experience, because I live analytic idealism now, it's not just something I talk about. I have been living it for years now. My life is informed by it. It's my reality. It's the best narrative I have, and I live accordingly. So I embody my own philosophy. I'm not just writing papers. I don't have to defend any academic position. So I'm
What
not
does that
forced.
do? What does that do in your life? That's a really strong thing. I
Yes,
want to understand it.
yes. So I can tell you what it does to me. It doesn't make me want to hold hands with everybody and sing the Kumbaya. No. If I were in Ukraine, I would have taken up arms right now. Um, if somebody threatens my girlfriend, there will be a response, which is not holding hands and singing the Kumbaya. So that
Yeah.
did not change. What it did to me is it's heightened my sense of empathy to a point that is sometimes difficult to bear. Um, it's the recognition that the subjectivity behind the eyes of someone else is the same subjectivity that is behind your eyes. Is that recognition. So it becomes very easy to use a colloquial expression to slide into somebody else's shoes if you allow yourself to do it. And sometimes you're pulled into it, like when major events happen, like October 7th in Israel, or like the bombardment of Gaza, or the war in Ukraine. You sort of, I feel dragged into somebody else's
Mm.
shoes, and it can become dysfunctional. So it's because I never had this before. I didn't evolve coping mechanisms for dealing with empathy. It's not something that afflicted me in my earlier years. So I'm having to evolve that very quickly now as an adult to be able to deal with it. Another thing it does for me is the greatest fear of mankind is back, because now I know that the subjectivity behind my eyes will experience my death and what happens afterwards. Bernardo Kastrup, this particular narrative self, this particular dissociated complex will dissolve. Um, but the subjectivity behind the storyteller that convinces itself it is Bernardo Kastrup, that subjectivity stays. So death is a unfathomable transition in my state of consciousness. Because look, psychedelics only reduce brain activity, and not even by a major amount. And it's very measurable, it's significant, but not major. And you can go through ego dissolution, and you can have terrible experiences just by a reduction of brain metabolism. Imagine when brain metabolism ceases. So that fear is back in my life. That fear of, okay, how is it going to be? How is it going to feel? What will be that state? And luckily, I have had enough psychedelic experiences. I live in the Netherlands, so I could do that responsibly as an adult a few years ago. I have had enough experiences to know that after the pain of ego dissolution, there is a space of profound peace, untouched peace. Um, so I hope that's where it's going to go. But I cannot know because my brain metabolism never stopped completely. It only ever got reduced by psychedelic use. So that is back. Another thing that has happened to me a lot is the crisis of meaning has disappeared from my life. Now I am like fish in the water. I don't talk about meaning like fish don't talk about water. I mean, I talk about it because I have to communicate to other people, but I don't talk to myself about meaning. Questions about meaning don't arise in my mind anymore. I'm surrounded by it every second of my existence. Every breath I take is sort of percolated with meaning. It's saturated with it. Nature is looking at itself through my eyes, and that's the meaning of my existence, whatever happens, and it's always there. So that's great. I am not touched by depression, by ennui, existential despair.
Do you feel
This,
closer to nature or to people that
oh,
you're with?
absolutely.
Has it changed your relationships with nature and with other humans, your girlfriend, your the people around
I,
you?
I am more appreciative of differences between people. I'm a lot less judgmental of people, not entirely judgment free. I judge Putin. You bet. I judge him through and through. Um, but I no longer have any impetus or energy to judge people gratuitously, like pass judgment on my neighbors, or pass judgment on people who think differently or act differently, pass judgment in regarding how they dress, what car they drive, how loud they speak, what topics of conversation they choose. I don't have any energy in me to pass judgment about that. I just experience it. The diversity of this subjectivity is something to be experienced and registered. That's all I do. I don't have energy for judgment anymore.
Is that because you've been able to surrender to something? Like, or is it because of clarity? Or what would you say? Is it?
People in spiritual circles, people talk about surrender a lot as if it were something you could do.
Yeah,
I,
I don't know why
I
that
think
word came up, but I guess it felt like when you were talking that it's not that you gave up because that's the not, and it's not that you won,
it
and
doesn't
it's
come up
not,
anymore.
it's like you see clearly, but there's a kind of flow or something, you know?
Yeah, to say to see clearly is already a kind of judgment. It,
So you're just present.
yeah, like great. I mean, I pass judgment if I have to, if I am in a position to do so. Like I have direct reports, so I have to judge their performance. I'm in a position to do that. I have to, so I do that objectively as much as I can. But I will not pass judgment on an acquaintance that came to my place and behaved in a certain way or dressed in a certain way or
Mm.
drank too much. It's like
So you
the
don't need
energy
to
to do that,
judge somebody to
doesn't
know who you
arise.
are, right? So it's, yeah.
If I'm not in a position to have to judge, the energy of judgment doesn't arise. I don't know. I, it's not like I surrendered. It's not like I gave up. It was not a choice I made. It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen anymore.
Hmm.
I don't bother. It's like I feel like yawning. It's like why am I going to bother to do
It's
this?
like a waste of energy.
It's a waste of energy. It's like I feel no
Yeah,
need or
which is true.
interest.
It's maybe that's why I say solve clearly, because sometimes judging isn't. I mean, there's a difference between just this is the way you see things and you state it versus like it needing to be referenced back to some egoic kind of thing that
I don't
all
know
of that.
whether it's more or less clear.
Yeah.
It's just how it is, how it has become for me. I used to judge people. The most difficult thing to deal with for me, at least since the war in Ukraine began, is heightened empathy. That's very difficult. It's a very present thing that struggled with daily. I'm becoming better at it. I'm finding rooms in the palace of my mind where I can sort of put those things there and close the door for a little while. I
Mm.
visit those rooms because if I don't visit them, I lose my humanity. So I cannot do that. I cannot abstract from away from human suffering. But I can. I found a place for it. I'm finding a place for it, and this is evolving in me. Before that, the most difficult thing to deal with was the fear of the major change in state of consciousness that is coming for all of us, called the death. That is not a fear I had before. Now, when you're dead, you're dead. You're not going to be there. And
You
you never
didn't have it
bothered with
before.
it. No, I didn't have it before. No.
Well, I thought maybe I shouldn't bring it up, but I just remember that you had a really hard, a really hard experience with it when you were really young, right? When you were reading the Jung and the I Ching, because you were really close to your dad, right? And he passed away. So for me, I'm wondering, am I just connecting that through some wrong way, or because that age, I remember being that age, and I remember things that happened to me at that age, and it's philosophical, or I don't know, it's yeah. Or is it just
Um,
too much to try to connect those
I
things?
mean, I probably have answered this question both in the positive and in the negative in the past. So
I
people
don't know.
who
You don't
one
even
day
have
in
I can also
future,
just edit it all out. I just
no, no,
it's
these
connected for
scholars
me,
100 years,
to try to understand it relative to why all this matters.
yeah.
Because yeah.
I can tell you this. Before my father died, I already had metaphysical questions popping in my head. Since as long as I can remember, I have always, I never got a religious education. My mother is a Catholic, but she never sent me to Sunday school, never forced
Hmm.
me to attend Mass, meaning I didn't. I didn't
Yeah.
do any of that stuff.
Yeah, I
I
hated
saw
church
her
when I was a
pray.
kid.
I saw her pray a couple of times, and I thought that's curious. I
Hmm.
didn't dismiss it. I just thought curious behavior. That humanity is capable of this. That was my thought as a kid. We're very neutral and impartial as kids. Something that the adults in us should learn.
Yeah.
Uh, so
That's
my
kind of what I
father's,
meant by surrender, by the way. That neutrality. That's the right word.
yeah,
But anyway.
my father's death didn't create metaphysical questions in my mind because I already had them. You see what I
Hmm.
mean? The main thing it did, it forced me to contemplate my own life. So what do I do now? What is this about now? How do I survive this? Where do I have to go? What do I have to do? That was the main struggle for me, and probably it heightened the metaphysical questions because you always wonder: does my father still exist somewhere?
Yeah, and where did he go? And on your own death, I was wondering because I'll just be really honest with you. I was around the same age the first time a family member died, and it was the first time I ever wrote anything. And I kind of wrote this little kind of poem about like how does something hurt you so much when you can't see it or reach out and touch it or something. It was some kind of rhymey thing, and I don't know. For me, those same questions have structured my bigger questions in a way when I look back. And I'm sure I could link it to a million other things, not just that. But um, this fear of death thing comes up a lot, and it's in all of us, and in all these things we've been talking about. It's kind of sitting there in a way, making us wonder what's the meaning of life, or what are we doing, and how do we deal with this fear. And so, yeah, I don't know. For
Yeah.
me, it's still something hard to get a grip on.
What I notice from talking to people is that people tend to associate their fear of death with the fear of oblivion, like they're going to
Mm-hmm.
cease to exist, and that leads to a cognitive dissonance. Why? Because deep inside they know that's not true. And we all know in the intuitive roots of our being, because we are connected with reality, right? We didn't parachute here. We arose out of reality, so we are part of reality. in those intuitive roots that connect us to reality. And they're very low down. They're not here in the canopy of airy thoughts. There we know we don't cease to exist. And therefore, because culturally we believe we do, it leads to a cognitive dissonance between what we feel deep inside and what we believe rationally. And that cognitive dissonance, I think, is partly what accounts for this recoil that people have about death. Like it's a kind of, I'm gonna die. No, no, this cannot be. Because if I die, the world dies, the world ends. And of course, that's true. If you were to really cease to exist as subjectivity, then everything would cease to exist. Meaning, it's not going to be like that. And but the fear of annihilation, that I don't have. So I don't struggle with trying to make my life count because I'm going to be annihilated at the end of it. No, that I don't have. I don't
So
have
it's not
that.
like this where you need to live forever or be.
Yeah,
Like, the reason I bring it, the reason what I'm connecting it to is when I said surrender, but it's this kind of neutrality. And I was asking you, like, what does idealism do for you? And I mean it even in a wider sense for kind of helping or count, I don't know what words to use, this materialist kind of track we've been on. It seems like this offers a way to relax back into, or it's not comfortable, but some kind of neutrality relative to these questions, in a way that helps. I mean, you don't need to fear death, right? But you said you still are afraid of death. So
of course. It's a major
yeah.
transition in my state of consciousness, and I don't know how it's going to feel. You bet I fear it. It's an
So is it
unknown.
fear like going on a roller coaster kind of fear, or
Well, that's
is
more
it?
predictable.
Yeah.
It's more predictable than this. I mean, we have these people who have these near-death experiences, right? I think even if you discard the majority of it, you are left with a set that is impossible to dismiss. By and large, they seem to be positive, but not unanimously so. There are people who have negative NDEs, and of course, they tell it already dressed in the conceptual dictionary of their own culture. So if they saw a reassuring presence, the Indian would say it's Krishna, the Christian would say it was Jesus. So you have to pierce through all of that symbolism that becomes that they dress the story with based on their own cultural dictionary because that's all they have to communicate whatever they can communicate. But underneath all that, I don't think there is unanimity that it's good. So it seems that it can go either way. So you bet I have anxiety about an unknown that I know is coming. It
So you
is
think you might
coming.
suffer or something? I guess I'm just because for me, I fear other people's deaths, or I don't worry about my death, or I don't have a sense of fear about that. I used to, but it like when people are troubled in my life, and I know, and it really worries me. And the way that you were talking about the empathy with, like I can't if I watch the news too much, I won't be able to function really well right now because it's just so those kind of things I still feel, even knowing the world is consciousness in a way and even feeling like the people who have died is still feeling present with them and being able to kind of understand what that is in a way that's kind of neutral. That's peaceful for me, but thinking of other people hurting and stuff still is very hard. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, for me too. Other people
Okay.
hurting, yes. Other people going through the transition we call death, the transition and state of consciousness. No, that because it's nature, right? One could argue suffering is part of nature as well, but my empathy makes it bothersome for me to deal with it.
Wow,
Um,
that's interesting. So it really is that subjective, personal to only you kind of mystery, right? That you don't know what in the world it's going to
yeah,
be.
and
Yeah.
look at there is that famous poem, and rage against the dying of the light. No, that I don't. I don't have any because that's raging against the prospect of annihilation, and there is nothing in me that believes in annihilation anymore. Even if I try to, I can't anymore.
But is some of that just because you've done so much and accomplished so much? And did you
no,
already feel that?
it's what analytic idealism informs me of, and I really gave it a 20-year-long thought.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not a conclusion I arrived at lightly, and I dug into every discipline that is even remotely relevant to this. I educated myself in multiple fields. So I can't do more homework than that to arrive at an informed
Well,
conclusion.
maybe
My
that's what's so neutral or good, that whatever we're trying to describe that you feel now, that seems to me almost like the time spent with it and all of
Yeah,
that. I
yeah.
mean, that comes.
Look, what I could tell you is I am in perfect peace with the fact that Bernardo Kastrup will die,
Okay.
but I am anxious about how that will feel like.
Because you don't
So
control it.
I'm
You
it,
can't understand it
because
or
it's an
control it.
unknown.
Yeah.
The best model we had, the best safe model we have, phenomenological model of the end of metabolism is the reduction of brain metabolism caused by psychedelics. And those experiences can be wonderful, but they can be very difficult too. And we do not have a clear understanding of the causative factors, the endogenous psychic causative factors that lead it, make it go one way or the other. So because we don't have that understanding, I don't have that understanding. So I don't know how it will go. So look, I don't think I'm going to
Mm.
be annihilated. um, you may say it's presumptuous of you to say you are sure, but I am as sure as a human being can be that I'm not going to be annihilated. And if others are in doubt, it's their journey. It's their own. I have my own journey. My reality is I'm not going to be annihilated. So I'm not raging against the dying of the light because it's not going to die, but it can become an ugly light. And I don't know how it's going to be. So I'm anxious about it in the sense that you would be anxious going to a foreign land without knowing what to expect, without
Mm.
having any idea what's going to happen. That kind of anxiety. You know you're going to experience it, you just don't know how it's going to be. But
I can understand that. But
there
yeah.
are other things that oppress the lives of most humans today, especially in the affluent West, which have to do with ennui, and lack of meaning, the meaning crisis, depression, nihilism. That is gone. I didn't even notice it disappearing from my life.
Hmm.
One day I
That's
looked
a
back and
huge
oh my
thing.
God, it's not
Gosh.
there anymore. It's
But that makes so much sense to me because it's like you've let yourself be what you are, connected. And,
yeah.
once we can do that, and I mean it in a really, really, it's not easy. And it's not like you just do it and then it's so, but it's such a different way of being in the world that you can't even really explain it.
Well, I tried to do that in a
Yeah,
book
you
that will
you
come
try
out
to
next
explain it
year.
in many ways, but
I shouldn't be talking about it yet, according to my publisher, but my
yeah, I wanted
2025.
to read it. For some reason I thought it was going to be out earlier, but yeah,
No,
it's
no,
coming
no.
out very soon.
There is a book coming out now, which
Oh,
is a summary of analytic idealism. It's analytic idealism in a nutshell.
in a
It's a
nutshell,
short
right?
book, straight to the
November.
point. Yeah, end of October.
Oh, okay.
Straight to the point, no bullshit, no divagations, just that. What analytic
With
idealism
a little
is.
brain in a nutshell on the
Yeah,
cover.
yeah. But there is a book that will come out next year. It's in
Oh, okay.
production already. It's called The Diamond and the Soul of the West.
Oh, wow.
Um, so I'm
That's
going to
amazing.
say some things now that I discuss at length in that book. One of the biggest changes for me it was the acceptance of the impersonal in me. Because you see, as an analytic idealist, I understand that I am a dissociated process in the mind of nature, which is one mind. So it's fundamentally an impersonal mind that creates, because everything that can happen in nature eventually does. So life did happen in nature. What is life? Well, it's a dissociation that arises in the mind of nature. It could arise, so eventually it does, because that's how nature works. You wait long enough, everything that can happen will happen. So that's what I am. What that means is that the personal in me is the product of the beginning of that dissociative process. But the medium on which it happens is the same medium that was there in the beginning of all things, if such a thing ever happened. It's completely impersonal. It's the sum total of existence. So I I intellectually now accept the existence and even the preponderance of the impersonal in me, of those mental processes that arise in me that are not Bernardo Kastrup's. They are the stream, the flow of the totality of nature as it expresses itself through me. Therefore, I will have using Schopenhauer's word, I will have the will to certain things that have nothing to do with Bernardo Kastrup's personal agenda. And we all experience that. We say, well, I really need to do this, but I don't know why. I just know that I must pursue this path. No, that's the impersonal in you. I, as an analytic idealist, I now give myself intellectual permission to acknowledge the existence of this impersonal flow as it flows through me and expresses itself through me. And that changes the way you live a lot because now you understand that your life has never been, is not, and will never be about you. Not any more than the life of the apple tree is about one apple blossom, right? It would be a very neurotic apple blossom, one who thought it's about me.
Mm.
No, it's about the apple tree. And you are
Mm-hmm.
just part of that impersonal thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand Bernardo Kastrup to be the apple blossom. In other words, it's about nature and what nature is trying to achieve through me. It's not about me. Therefore, I do not have the responsibility to make myself happy, which is the most overwhelming task that the cultural ethos invests us with. One,
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible. There are way too many variables at play for you to be able to control them. So you cannot make yourself happy. You may find yourself happy because of grace and circumstance, but it's not something that you can force in nature. And parting with that need to make myself happy, it's like removing a ton of weight from my shoulder. Um, I no
Is
longer
that,
plan.
yeah?
I
Is
don't
that
plan long term.
n- that's not surrender, but I think that's what I was trying to get at with that word. It's I like what you said about lifting the weight off, but
Yeah,
is
the
it
word surrender, it sounds like it's something you decide, right? Like an
right?
army
Right.
decides it's time to surrender.
It's
I never
almost like
decided it.
yielding or aligning, or it's like you.
It's not an action of me. It happens to me.
Mm-hmm. But you're
So
kind of letting life flow through you without needing to filter it through Bernardo, the
you,
narrative.
you could say that. So I pay attention to my impersonal inner compass. Where is nature wanting to go through me? And my job is to accept that and then use my intellectual abilities to make it more viable or to facilitate that process. So I, the metaphor I use in the book, I, the way I live life now is as a driver who didn't choose the destination. I am given the destination by the impersonal, but I am trusted with navigating the terrain. And therefore, I do it with the curiosity of someone who doesn't know where he's going, but will find out and is trusted with navigating it. So, which is fun.
I love that,
Um,
especially after the story you told about driving and not knowing you're driving, because that's the opposite, right? It's being fully aware and present that you're driving, but not needing to know where you're going to
I
go
don't
or
choose the direction.
choosing
Life
the
has just
directions.
chosen a
Yeah.
completely different direction from me now with the
That's very peaceful
synthetics.
in a way. I can feel it. I don't know how to put words on it, but I can feel it. And I already kept you way over time, but I have to ask last thing is how does that relate to love at all? Or how do you see that word relative to this? Does it turn you is it a word you don't use or I bring it up because it
It's
makes people
it
uncomfortable and yeah.
well, no, it's I you know, we all have our prejudices. I'm no exception to this. I have a prejudice against sentimentalism. It's something that makes me
Yeah.
cringe very quickly.
Me too, but I don't think that word is that. So
Yes, so,
that's
so
why
I'm
I
trying
try to
to,
make this uncomfortable space because
yeah,
yeah.
I know what you mean. So
Mhm.
I'll try to navigate that without falling for the sentimentalist trap. Look, love is a fact of nature, just as fear is, and hate is, and suffering is. So if we accept that all these things are inherent in the potentialities of nature, then yes, love exists. What I see a lot of people do, especially people in the spiritual circle, and look, I'm not an enlightened being, and they may be. I'm sure enlightened beings exist. I know of at least one, that monk who set himself on fire during the Vietnam War and stayed in a meditation position For the 20
Incredible.
minutes it must have taken for him to actually die, didn't move a muscle, completely
Yeah.
peaceful, no change in his facial expression. That's enlightenment, all right? That's you don't do that if you're just fooling yourself that you are
Hmm.
enlightened. That's mastery of one's own mind. That's a direct connection to what is really true. So it exists. Beyond that, I don't know who is enlightened, but some people who claim or are perceived as being enlightened will tell you that love is more fundamental than fear, than hate, and than all the rest. I don't know that from personal experience, and there is no analytic line of thinking that I can think of that would lead you to that conclusion. Every piece of evidence I know and every piece of reasoning I trust would bring me to the conclusion that love is as true as all the other feelings. So it's as true as hate, it's as true as fear. It is true. It's just not more true than the other stuff. So does love exist in my life? You bet it. You bet. We get confused sometimes about it. We mix up love with infatuation. We mix up love with dependency. But now I'm turning 50, and I think I have earned enough maturity now to know what is true love, and it's there. It is there in my life. Anxiety is there, and even hate. I could tell you today, I hate Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. I wish that guy wasn't born. And at the same time, there is a bigger voice in me saying, that's silly. If he wasn't born, somebody else would have been born. And do something like that. Maybe not the same thing, but something like that was going to happen, was bound to happen because it can happen. And if it can, it will. It would have another name, another face, different circumstances, maybe a different part of the world. But it was going to happen. And yes, it's true. And yet I can't help but look at that guy's face and feel like laser beams are coming out of my eye, of my eyes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I think we all know in some situation or another like that. And I think it's important to feel it and be able to express it. And I won't argue with you about love being different from that. But when I listen to you, or when I read you, or when I think about all that you've done and all that you do in terms of all these kind of conversations you have with people and writing all the books and stuff, from my definition of love, which is I won't try to put it in words, but it feels like that's there, you know. It doesn't feel like hate is there or I know you've said fear is there, but it doesn't feel like love feels different to me as being able to connected with that flow that I was talking about of life kind of going through. To me it feels almost more like that's kind of when you're all the other stuff is out of the way somehow, which doesn't make all the other stuff less real or not important, but just looking at your life from the outside, it seems like that would be more of extreme, and the other things would be more like lenses or obstacles or something. But that's
Well,
yeah.
what I can, okay,
And I mean even love like philosophy and too like I don't mean love in a sentimental infatuation. I mean as a motivating movement, something.
I I identify with people and the world. I feel very human.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And
Even when you just described your hate, right? That's coming from
yes,
a
and I
very
prize
deep
it.
identification.
Yeah, I prize it
Yeah.
very much. And one danger that people playing the social role I play go through, and I'm subject to to that danger, is people want to kick you upstairs, if you know what I mean.
Name you and label you
Oh,
or
they put you on a pedestal, they elevate you, and therefore they make you non-human.
yeah,
Uh,
that's what I was
and
trying to get at earlier of how easily you can get trapped by your own accomplishments.
well,
You know?
no,
Not
I
you,
don't do
but
that to
one.
myself. No, no,
No.
I'm past that.
Well, you've sort of
I
built that
haven't
into your system, but
I haven't been that silly for a few years now. No,
well, that's good.
I'm not going to fall for that trap. I'm not going to believe myself to be something more than human. I know too much the shit and the skeletons in my cabinets to entertain that fantasy. No, I don't think. Well, I think we are all. Nobody's immune to that, but I think I am as partially immune as one can get at this point. I know too much of my own shit. But others do that, and others kick you upstairs. And this is not a criticism to them. They are not doing this maliciously. Actually, they think they're honoring you. They think they're doing something positive towards you. But I feel robbed of my humanity when people do that. So my humanity is my greatest treasure. I'm going to defend it with tooth and claw. you know,
Mm.
it if you try to dehumanize me in any way, like making me better than human or lesser than human, I'm going to resist that. And that has brought me to a place of contentment. I'm not going to use the word happiness, especially because in the US, what people understand for the word happiness is very different than what we understand in Europe. In Europe, I could use the words happiness and contentment as equivalents. In the US, they aren't.
No.
In the US, happiness is something somehow more effusing, more effervescent than contentment. While for the European, happiness is just contentment. So I achieved I landed. I didn't achieve. I didn't do anything. I landed in a point of contentment in my life because of my humanity, my having achieved a warm, respectful relationship with my own humanity, which I treasure a lot. And that's maybe what you mean by surrender. Th- There is an involuntary letting go associated with the
Letting go.
recognition
That's better. Yeah.
you're human, you are in a human journey. That's it. That's just nature. So let's just journey. Let's just go through this without trying to wrestle control of the reins of my journey from the hands of nature and control everything and assert my personhood, my uniqueness, as if we were Übermensch, as if we were superhuman, like Nietzsche tried and failed for a reason, because there isn't a better man to try that. And even that man,
No, and he tried so with such heart, and it's
yeah, and
totally
he failed. So
understandable.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
lesson that he left for us. That's his sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I am free from the temptation of trying to control life in the world. I did try it. I tried it for over 2 decades with the illusion that it could be achieved. And then I realized it can't, and then I fell into hell for over 10 years. And now I am reconciled with my humanity, with my role as just a blossom in the apple tree, that controls nothing but has its role to play, just like me. I don't control anything. I have my role to play, and I'm in peace with it. And let's see what's going to happen next. So maybe that's what you call surrender, but it's not an act. I didn't one day wake up and say, okay, today I'm going to surrender. It
Yeah.
it happened to me. I find myself in this space.
Yeah, I still don't know what it's almost like a recognition too. Like similar to what you described when you had the feeling that you're not the world, but the opposite. Like you realize you are the world, but what you thought was the world is something different now because you've made this whole journey through all these stuff and you persisted. And when you were talking, I was also thinking of something I remember reading or hearing you say about the heart being no, the intellect is the bouncer of the heart. No,
Yeah.
yeah, and that would be a whole other conversation to open that up. But in a way, you kind of could turn that around too. There's kind of a way like that. There's no bouncer anymore, right? But you don't need a bouncer anymore.
Well, I think it's there. It's just that it's a very open-minded bouncer. It's a kind and
Yeah, I
open-minded
guess that's what I
bouncer.
mean because you say it as if the bouncer is bad, right? Because we pretend like we use our intellect to say how we think we should feel instead of looking at how we feel. But you kind of had to confront how you feel, and now you use the intellect to keep yourself in check
Well,
or something. I don't know.
I wouldn't underestimate the power my intellect still has in my life, and it's just that my intellect arrived at a place where it can give me permission for a lot of stuff, but it is still the bouncer. And when do I know that? When I am exposed, for instance, I run Essential Foundation now, so I have I'm basically the curator of what we publish, what we promote, and what we stay away from. And because Essential Foundation now has gotten some momentum, a lot of people want their voices to be amplified by us. So I am in that in the position of a sort of a bit of a gatekeeper. Of course, other people digest stuff for me, but it comes to a point where I say, okay, this we are going to run with, and
Mm-hmm.
this we are not. So I'm regularly exposed to stuff that I take a quick look at and I think, bullshit, woo woo, nonsense, scam, you know?
Mm.
No, we are not running with this crap. No, this is nonsensical. And that judgment call is often really intellectual. And sometimes it flirts with prejudice because look, I'm human, right? And I'm in peace with being human. And part of being human is that you're prejudiced.
Well,
The
you
only
have
thing
a
I can,
path, right? Like we were talking about. I mean, you've come to where you are through certain references, even if you have learned the knowledge through acquisition or however you put it. I mean, you can't like just do away with the fact that you've
no, no,
read
not
all
at
these books and know all these things and so
Yeah,
on. It's gonna,
neither
yeah.
do I want to become the Ubermensch and be completely unprejudiced. I think what counts in my favor is that I recognize my prejudice and I try to deal with it in a healthy way as opposed to being completely overcome by it. But I still, so even if I eventually get a hold of it and act in a non prejudiced way, I feel the prejudice emerge within me at first requiring the intellect to go there and say, wait a moment. This, if you say the same thing in words that you like better, you may actually be open to this. You just don't like the particular words, the particular avenue in
Mm-hmm.
which this is being brought forth, or the motivations people have. You know, I tell you one big trigger for me that triggers my prejudice very quickly is when people defend a point of view about what is true because they think it's ethical or because they think it makes them feel good. There was a person once, shall not name the person, but there was a discussion about metaphysics. And this person said, I don't like idealism because um, it's totalitarian. It's one mind. This is too totalitarian. It affects my political sensitivities. I think it should be a democracy. And I'm like, what does truth care about your damn political sensitivities, about what makes you warm and fuzzy and what gives you a cold shiver? Is this a bloody argument to make to defend a story? That really triggers me. And it happened to me the other day, a very respectable academic who I hold in sincere high regard and we were having a private discussion. There were three of us. And this academic slid into the notion of we should promote this because it's conducive to better social harmony. We should promote this as true because it's conducive to more social harmony. Oh, that triggered me. It's like, why should I believe something to be true just because it triggers social harmony? If the truth is terrible and conducive to anarchy and war, then that's it. That's what the truth is. So it so this can happen even when the person's story is entirely reasonable. And we should promote it, but it's presented to me as we should promote it because it's good for people. It triggers me. So
I can understand that because it kind of is almost a sign that the person hasn't thought through it in a kind of deep way because it almost sounds like, you know, you just role play, like you take on a role of if it social harmony is a good thing we've been taught and so therefore if I
we should
fit this into
construct
that
truth.
role,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, look,
I see that.
there is even an argument to do that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's Nietzsche's argument. No, I
Oh.
think it is in the gay science or the joyful wisdom, because the word gay
Yes.
now has been
Yeah.
associated with something else. But in the joyful wisdom, the vrolijke Wissenschaft, the joyful wisdom,
Sounds good.
I think it is there that Nietzsche says, why are we all obsessed with what is true? Why does it matter what is true? We should adopt a narrative that makes life good, not what is true. We can never know what is true. And it doesn't matter because what matters is what effect it will have in life. So we simply should adopt a narrative conducive to whatever it is that we consider good. He makes that argument. And it is a very compelling argument. The problem for me is that I am too instinctively committed to what is true. I do not have in me the ability to adopt a narrative and pretend that it is true just because it's good in some way. I cannot make myself believe it. Actually, it will create the opposite reaction in me. Even if it is believable, because I'm forcing myself to believe it because it's good, something in me will recoil and say, no, for that reason, I will reject it, even if it is plausible. Um, so I have it.
Yeah, I really understand. There's two things. Like one of those could just be the the philosopher in you, right? That you need to always question and stuff. That that always criticizing whatever it is, not just like there's a good and we go along with it. But I think deeper than that, it's kind of the way you've been living your life in this nestedness that I was talking about. I was saying like dissociation, but these many nested levels of consciousness, right? Where you can't you can't just go along with something like that because it would numb that whole process. Like it's no longer the pattern that even works, right? It's a totally
Well,
different rhythm.
but the conclusion, Andrea, is, and to go back to how we started this discussion, is the intellect is still strong in me, not in the sense that it's a clever intellect, but in the sense that it has a lot of decision power for me. It's very influential. So despite all this, despite my being in a very different place in life than I was 20 years ago today, and despite my openness, which is there, I'm much more open to alternatives that before I wouldn't take seriously. Despite all that, the intellect is still the bouncer of my heart. It's just that it's a more sensitive and open minded bouncer now, but it can still shut the door and it will shut the door. Every now and then it just, no, no, here we are not going. Because this is just nonsense. We are not approaching this.
Yeah. I think that's probably a healthy thing, especially as I've expressed that I think you've opened your heart quite a lot, right? And to be able to do that, you need some bouncers. But for now, I just want to say thank you for I've kept you an hour and a half, or I don't even know what time it is, but longer, a lot longer. And I could keep going because I didn't even look at half of my questions. But mostly, I just want to say thank you for your time and for what you're doing, and that you are open to this whole process, right? And sharing all this in all the ways, different ways.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was a nice talk.
It was. And good night. I guess I can stop this